After I became a widower, my only daughter sent me a message stating I would not get a single cent from my late wife's inheritance. She told me her white husband was more of a man than I could ever be. At the official inheritance meeting, my son-in-law openly humiliated me for my working-class hands and my silent demeanor. They assumed my silence was a sign of surrender, a complete capitulation to their hostile takeover. But when the estate attorney finally read the hidden clause in the documents, those greedy vultures never saw the absolute ruin coming their way. My name is Clifton. I am 69 years old, and I am still healing from the profound wounds my own family inflicted upon my life. As a successful commercial contractor who built an empire from the ground up, I survived the ruthless business world, but I never expected my greatest enemies to be the people sitting at my own dinner table. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. The heavy, hollow thud of loose dirt hitting Evelyn's polished mahogany casket still echoed relentlessly in my ears. I sat alone in the center of my dark living room wearing my tailored black suit. The house we had shared for 4 decades felt entirely foreign, stripped of the warmth and grace she had always provided. I did not turn on the lights. I simply stared at the empty armchair across from me, processing the brutal reality of a life without my anchor. My phone vibrated against the dark oak coffee table, shattering the heavy silence. I picked it up, expecting a message of condolence from an old friend or a former business partner. Instead, the screen displayed a text from my only daughter, Naomi. The words she typed were laced with absolute venom and entitlement. She bluntly stated that I would not get a single cent of Evelyn's money. She declared that she and her husband were taking immediate control of the estate. She ended the message by calling me a weak, obsolete old man, claiming her husband Gavin was infinitely more of a man than I could ever hope to be. She did not offer a single word of sorrow for the mother we had just buried in the cold ground hours ago. I did not reply to her vicious message. I did not shed a tear or raise my voice in the empty room. I placed the phone in my pocket, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the biting evening air. I climbed into my reliable 10-year-old heavy-duty truck. It was a vehicle that showed the honest wear of decades of labor, a stark contrast to the imported luxury cars my daughter preferred. The engine roared with a steady rhythm, grounding my thoughts as I prepared to face their betrayal. I drove directly through the city streets toward the imposing glass tower of the estate attorney's law office. The neon city lights reflected off my windshield, illuminating a path I knew I had to walk with absolute precision. I parked my truck between 2 pristine sports cars in the underground garage. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. The receptionist guided me silently to the main boardroom. I pushed open the heavy glass doors. Gavin and Naomi were already seated at the massive conference table. They wore smug, triumphant expressions, looking more like lottery winners than grieving family members. Gavin leaned back in his expensive leather chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water. He did not offer his condolences for my loss. He openly mocked my appearance. He pointed a manicured finger at my calloused, scarred hands resting on the table. He stated with a sneer that a lifetime of manual labor had left me far too ignorant to handle real generational wealth. He called my truck an embarrassment and told me it was time for the educated class to take over the family finances. He claimed his degree gave him the fundamental right to dictate my future. I remained entirely silent, letting his arrogance fill the room. I did not bother to inform this boy about the reality of my life. I briefly recalled the 40 grueling years I spent building a massive commercial contracting firm from absolute scratch. I navigated a deeply segregated city, fighting for every single contract, outsmarting men twice as ruthless as the boy sitting across from me. I endured the systemic barriers, the closed-door deals, and the racial prejudices that sought to keep me at the bottom. When my company finally struck gold and secured major city contracts, we faced a racially motivated corporate lawsuit designed to bankrupt my enterprise. I placed every single asset, every property, and every dollar into Evelyn's name 30 years ago to protect our family from that targeted attack. Naomi never knew the true origin of the money. She grew up believing her mother was the sole financial genius while I was just a simple laborer. The estate attorney entered the room carrying a thick leather binder. He cleared his throat and opened the documents, casting a brief, nervous glance in my direction. He began to read Evelyn's final will and testament aloud. The division of assets was explicit and uncompromising. The attorney announced that Naomi would inherit the entirety of the liquid estate. which included the visible bank accounts and the primary investment portfolios. Naomi gasped in pure delight, clutching Gavin's arm. The attorney then turned a page and stated that I would inherit the Legacy Holding Company, an entity described on paper as a dormant, inactive shell corporation with no visible capital. Gavin threw his head back and laughed out loud. The sound of his mocking laughter bounced off the glass walls. He taunted me, declaring I was walking away with a stack of worthless empty papers while he and Naomi walked away with an empire. I maintained my composure. I did not show a fraction of anger or disappointment. I picked up the silver pen resting on the table and signed the legal acknowledgement without a single word of protest. I stood up, buttoned my black suit jacket, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them to celebrate their hollow victory. I stepped into the descending elevator and waited for the heavy doors to slide shut. Once I was completely alone in the steel box, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my secure, encrypted banking application. A pre-programmed banking alert flashed across my screen, confirming exactly what I had structured decades ago. The liquid estate Naomi had just eagerly inherited was legally tied to a massive hidden corporate debt from a failed commercial venture we had deliberately isolated. It was a ticking financial time bomb designed to absorb massive liabilities. Furthermore, the worthless shell company I had just inherited was the actual vault. It legally held the direct deeds to multiple commercial properties, including the exact building where Gavin and Naomi's luxury penthouse was located. I owned the roof over their heads. I owned the very ground they slept on. As the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors slid open, a cold, resolute smile touched my lips. The trap was set perfectly, and the game had officially begun. I parked my truck in the reserved spot outside the First National Bank branch at exactly 7:55 in the morning. The bitter rain from the previous night had frozen into a thin, treacherous layer of ice across the black asphalt, but my heavy work boots found solid traction. I stood outside the thick glass doors, my posture straight, waiting until the uniformed security guard turned the brass deadbolt right at 8 o'clock. I walked straight past the empty teller line, ignoring the polite greetings from the staff, and pushed open the frosted glass door to the branch manager's office without knocking. Valerie sat behind her polished mahogany desk, calmly sipping a cup of steaming herbal tea. I did not offer a morning greeting or a polite apology for the intrusion. I dropped the heavy manila folder containing the forged bridge loan documents directly onto the center of her leather blotter. The sharp, violent crack of paper hitting the solid wood made her jump in her chair, spilling hot tea across her manicured hands and expensive silk blouse. She looked up. Her mouth opened to reprimand the intruder, but the color drained entirely from her face the second she met my eyes. She knew exactly who I was, and the trembling of her hands told me she knew exactly what she had done. I placed my palms flat on the edge of her desk and leaned forward, casting a long shadow over her workspace. I demanded a full, uncompromising explanation regarding the unauthorized $2 million encumbrance placed on my primary estate. Valerie's voice shook as she frantically wiped the spilled tea from her desk with a tissue. She avoided my piercing gaze, reaching into her bottom file drawer to pull out a notarized legal document. She slid the thick paper across the desk with shaking fingers. It was a comprehensive power of attorney. The document explicitly claimed I was suffering from severe aggressive dementia and was entirely incapable of managing my own financial affairs or making rational decisions. Valerie admitted that Blake had sat in that exact chair yesterday afternoon. He had presented the fraudulent document with absolute confidence and explicitly ordered her to freeze all my personal accounts immediately. He had convinced her I was a violent risk to myself and my family, spinning a lie about my declining mental health. I stared at the forged signature on the bottom line. Blake had orchestrated a complete financial execution, while my wife's body was barely cold in the ground. I asked Valerie why she did not simply pick up the phone to call me and verify such a catastrophic claim. She stammered, claiming Blake threatened to sue the bank for gross negligence if she delayed his asset protection protocols by even an hour. Before Valerie could offer another pathetic corporate excuse, the heavy glass doors of her office swung open. Blake stood in the doorway, blocking the exit. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the truck I drove. He was not alone. Two massive men in matching dark suits flanked him like professional corporate bodyguards. Their aggressive posture and thick necks indicated they were not accountants or legal aides. Blake had brought hired muscle to intimidate the bank staff into releasing the remaining liquid cash from my frozen accounts. He stepped into the office with absolute unchecked arrogance, a triumphant smile plastered across his face. That smile vanished the instant he saw me standing by the manager's desk. He froze in his tracks, his eyes darting around the room, clearly calculating how an old, supposedly demented man had bypassed his digital locks, retrieved the hidden ledger, and figured out his morning banking schedule. But his inherent arrogance quickly overtook his initial surprise. He sneered at me, adjusting his expensive silk tie to regain his composure. He instructed Valerie to call building security immediately and have the confused old man escorted to the nearest medical psychiatric transport vehicle. He stepped forward, intending to physically block my access to the manager and take control of the room. He told me I was making a fool of myself in public and that it was time to let the educated adults handle the heavy lifting. I did not move. I stood my absolute ground between him and the mahogany desk. Blake let out an exasperated sigh, treating me like a disobedient child. He raised his right hand and attempted to forcefully shove me aside by my shoulder to get to Valerie. He fully expected the brittle, yielding resistance of an elderly man broken by grief and age. He received something entirely different. I did not flinch. Before his palm could connect with my jacket, my left hand snapped up and seized his wrist mid-air. I clamped my fingers around his radius and ulna, locking his joint in an inescapable vice grip. Blake gasped in sudden sharp shock as I twisted his wrist downward at a severe, unnatural angle. He tried to yank his arm back, planting his feet to pull away, but my grip only tightened like industrial steel. The physical strength required to haul cinder blocks, mix mortar, and lay brick for 20 straight years does not simply fade away with age. I spent 2 brutal decades under the blistering sun hauling heavy steel beams and building foundations by hand before my contracting firm ever saw the inside of a corporate boardroom. That kind of relentless labor weaves dense, unyielding muscle directly into the bone. Blake had spent his entire adult life typing on ergonomic keyboards and drinking overpriced craft cocktails in air-conditioned offices. He fundamentally underestimated the dense survival-built strength of the man standing in front of him. I applied precise, agonizing pressure to his nerve clusters. His knees buckled slightly and the smug color drained from his face as a sharp whine of genuine pain escaped his throat. I stepped forward, using my body weight to force him backward out of the office and directly into the open bank lobby. I slammed his back hard against a cold marble pillar. His 2 hired men stepped forward, reaching inside their jackets, but I locked eyes with them, daring them to escalate. They hesitated, unsure if they were being paid enough to assault a senior citizen in front of a dozen high-definition federal bank cameras. I leaned close to Blake's ear. I told him he had made a fatal miscalculation by dragging my wife into his criminal schemes. Valerie rushed out of her office, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished marble floor. She held a printed banking manifest in her trembling hands. She nervously interrupted the physical standoff, speaking loudly enough for the security cameras to pick up her official recorded declaration. She informed Blake that the accounts could not be touched by anyone today, not even with his notarized power of attorney. Blake fought against my grip, sweating profusely, screaming at Valerie that he was the legal conservator and she was federally mandated to release the $2 million in cash immediately. Valerie shook her head frantically. She explained that the Federal Fraud Division had flagged the massive bridge loan transaction overnight. The automated federal banking system had detected severe irregularities in the digital signature mapping and the rapid routing of the funds. Because the loan involved federal bank lines moving across international borders, the accounts were now under an active federal lock. No money could move in or out of the institution until a designated federal auditor cleared the encumbrance. I released Blake's wrist and stepped back. He stumbled forward, clutching his bruised arm and gasping for air. The realization of the federal flag hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The massive sum of money he desperately needed was trapped behind miles of impenetrable federal red tape. He spun toward his 2 hired men, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He told them they needed to change tactics immediately. He stated they had to bypass the bank entirely and sell my physical estate by nightfall, no matter the cost or the buyer. He ordered the men to follow him and sprinted out of the bank doors into the freezing morning rain. I stood in the quiet lobby watching his taillights disappear down the wet street. Blake was panicked, which made him infinitely more dangerous. He was going to liquidate my property out from under me before the federal auditors arrived. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I realized I needed a ruthless, deeply connected legal ally immediately. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors of Vance and Associates. The lobby was a temple of polished marble modern art and absolute corporate intimidation. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly structured headset and a practiced look of disdain, did not look up from her monitor. She informed me that the partners did not accept walk-in appointments. She suggested I leave a contact number or visit a legal aid clinic across town. I did not argue with her. I did not explain who I was or why I was standing in her immaculate lobby wearing a faded canvas jacket and work boots. I pulled a pen from my pocket, tore a blank sheet from the notepad on her desk, and wrote down a highly specific 12-digit routing number. I placed the paper flat on her keyboard. I instructed her to hand that exact sequence of numbers directly to Mitchell Vance and tell him his oldest investor was waiting in the lobby. She scoffed, clearly irritated by my absolute refusal to leave. She picked up the paper between two manicured fingers, rolled her eyes, and walked toward the heavy oak doors that led to the executive suites. She returned less than 2 minutes later. She was practically sprinting, her face flushed with sudden panic. Before she could utter an apology, the heavy oak doors burst open. Mitchell Vance stormed into the lobby. He was a ruthless corporate litigator, a man whose hourly rate exceeded my original contracting salary, and he completely ignored the staring clients in the waiting area. He crossed the marble floor, grabbed my hand, and immediately ushered me past the reception desk into his massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. He locked the door behind us and closed the automated blinds. Mitchell owed his entire career, his pristine office, and his absolute power to a quiet, anonymous scholarship I had funded 20 years ago. I recognized his sheer brilliance when he was just a struggling, desperate kid from my old neighborhood fighting to survive the same systemic barriers I had faced. He knew I never asked for favors. He knew my presence in his office signaled an absolute catastrophe. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my leather duffel bag and laid the master ledger flat on his glass desk. I pulled the forged bridge loan documents and the subsequent bank records, placing them precisely next to the ledger. I told Mitchell that Gavin had forged my signature to steal $2 million and was currently executing a hostile takeover of my estate using a fraudulent power of attorney. Mitchell pulled a pair of reading glasses from his suit pocket. He reviewed the documents in absolute silence. His eyes moved rapidly across the forged signatures and the complex digital routing numbers. He verified the holding company I inherited through the local registry portal. He confirmed my statement with a sharp nod. The seemingly worthless shell corporation legally controlled over $40 million in untraceable commercial real estate. Mitchell pulled out a legal pad and began drafting. He did not ask how I obtained the bank records or how I bypassed the security systems. He only cared about deploying maximum legal force. Mitchell informed me that Gavin's reliance on the bridge loan was a massive tactical error. The loan required immediate collateral verification, which meant the bank would inevitably send physical appraisers to the property. Gavin was trapped in a timeline he could not control. Mitchell rapidly typed an emergency federal injunction on his secure terminal. He explained that this document would instantly freeze the title of my estate, making it entirely impossible for Gavin to legally transfer, sell, or monetize the land. He hit print, stamped the document with his official seal, and informed me that we were going to the county courthouse to file it directly with a federal judge. He promised to rip Gavin's life apart layer by layer. Before he could hand me the freshly printed injunction, the heavy oak door of his office burst open. Mitchell's lead paralegal rushed into the room. She was out of breath and holding a digital tablet. She did not apologize for the intrusion. She placed the tablet on the glass desk and hit play on a live video feed. She stated that she had been monitoring the county permit registry for any sudden activity on my property address. Gavin had not waited for a standard real estate listing. He had completely bypassed the traditional market. The live footage showed an unlicensed aggressive demolition crew rolling onto my property. Gavin had hired them under the table to tear down the historic guest house located at the edge of the estate. He believed that destroying the physical structures would clear the land for a rapid, unquestionable commercial sale to corporate developers. The bulldozers were already unloading from the flatbed trucks. The heavy steel treads tore through the manicured lawn I had planted 30 years ago. I stared at the screen, recognizing the immediate, devastating threat. The guest house was not just a building. It contained Evelyn's preserved art studio, her paintings, and the last tangible pieces of her creative legacy. Gavin was going to bulldoze my wife's memory to save himself from a fraud charge. The legal game was suddenly a physical war. Mitchell grabbed his briefcase and the federal injunction. We walked out of the office without another word. The tires of Mitchell's sedan threw gravel into the air as we skidded to a halt near the edge of my property. The heavy rhythmic vibration of diesel engines rattled the windows before I even opened my door. The air smelled of burnt fuel and freshly turned earth. I stepped out of the vehicle and looked toward the eastern boundary of the estate. A massive yellow commercial bulldozer was positioned perfectly parallel to the gravel driveway. Its scarred steel blade was raised, gleaming under the overcast sky, aimed directly at the structural supports of the historic guest house. 4 flatbed trucks were idling near the perimeter, blocking the main exit. Unlicensed contractors in unfastened safety vests swarmed the lawn, carrying heavy chains and demolition tools. Gavin had moved with the reckless speed of a desperate man. He bypassed every municipal zoning law and every standard real estate regulation to wipe the land clean. He wanted a vacant commercial lot to sell to the highest bidder by sunset. I did not wait for Mitchell. I walked straight across the wet grass, my dark suit absorbing the misting rain. The primary bulldozer shifted gears with a mechanical shriek. Black smoke belched from its exhaust stack as the heavy treads chewed through the manicured lawn. The machine lunged forward, closing the distance to the guest house walls. I did not yell or wave my arms. I stepped directly into the path of the advancing steel treads. I planted my boots firmly into the damp soil, folded my arms across my chest, and stared straight through the reinforced glass of the operator's cab. The machine was 10 feet away, then 5 feet. The immense physical weight of the equipment shook the ground beneath my feet. I did not flinch. I did not blink. The driver slammed on the air brakes. The bulldozer skidded forward, the massive steel blade halting less than 3 feet from my chest. The sudden silence of the stalled tracks was deafening. The foreman threw open the cab door and stepped out onto the metal track. He was a large, abrasive man holding a heavy radio. He screamed at me to get out of the way, threatening to have his men forcibly remove me from the site. He claimed he had a signed work order and a strict deadline. Before I could answer, Gavin stormed out from the side entrance of the main house. He wore a bright yellow jacket over his designer clothes, playing the role of a legitimate property developer. His face was flushed with absolute unhinged rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me and ordered the foreman to start the engine back up. He screamed that he owned the dirt, he owned the buildings, and he owned the right to run over anyone trespassing on his construction site. He commanded the crew to forcibly drag me into the street. I stood my ground, my eyes locked on the white paneled door of the guest house just behind me. Gavin saw an old structure taking up valuable real estate. He saw brick and timber standing in the way of his rapid cash liquidation. He did not know what was inside. He did not care. 30 years ago, I reinforced the foundation of that specific building with my own hands. I soundproofed the interior walls and installed panoramic skylights across the entire roof. I built that space specifically for Evelyn. It was her private art studio. Inside those walls sat hundreds of her original canvas paintings, her dried oil palettes, and the easel where she had spent the happiest afternoons of our 4-decade marriage. It was a sacred sanctuary preserving the last physical remnants of her creative soul. I would let the treads of that machine crush my bones into the soil before I ever allowed Gavin to desecrate Evelyn's memory for a quick payout. I braced my legs, preparing to physically dismantle the first contractor who dared to step within striking distance. A sharp, artificial electronic chime cut through the tension. I turned my head slightly. Naomi was standing on the elevated stone walkway near the rose garden. She held her expensive smartphone horizontally, aiming the camera lens directly at my face. The red recording light blinked steadily in the gray morning mist. She wore a highly satisfied, arrogant smirk. She positioned herself perfectly to capture my confrontation with the demolition crew. She narrated the scene loudly for the camera, speaking in a fabricated tone of absolute terror. She claimed her violent, completely unstable father had broken out of a facility and was actively terrorizing a legitimate home improvement project. She begged the camera for help, painting me as an unhinged lunatic who was trying to assault her husband and destroy their peaceful family life. She was producing a highly edited, weaponized piece of digital theater. She intended to ruin my reputation before I could even defend myself. I did not break my posture. I did not acknowledge her camera or her poisonous performance. I simply watched Mitchell walk calmly across the ruined lawn. My lawyer did not rush. He moved with the cold, calculated precision of a corporate executioner. He carried a single manila folder. He bypassed Gavin entirely and walked straight to the bulldozer. He looked up at the screaming foreman and held out a thick stack of legal papers bearing the heavy embossed seal of a federal judge. Mitchell spoke in a voice that demanded absolute obedience. He informed the foreman that he was holding an emergency federal injunction. He He explicitly stated that the land title for the entire massive commercial estate was currently frozen under an active, highly secured federal fraud investigation. The foreman stopped yelling. He climbed down from the heavy metal track and snatched the papers from Mitchell's hand. The abrasive confidence vanished from his face the moment he read the bold federal crest at the top of the page. Unlicensed contractors operating under the table fear nothing more than the direct scrutiny of the federal government. The foreman turned completely pale. He read the precise legal coordinates outlining the property boundaries. He realized instantly that Gavin had lied to him. Gavin had hired them to demolish a federally protected crime scene. The foreman dropped his heavy steel radio. He turned toward the rest of the crew and made a sharp, sweeping motion across his throat. The diesel engines died immediately. The overwhelming roar of the machinery was replaced by the sound of the falling rain. The foreman looked at Gavin with absolute disgust. He informed the deeply panicked boy that the site was dead. He stated that his crew was leaving immediately and promised to break Gavin's jaw if he ever tried to contact them again. Gavin stood paralyzed in the mud. His illegal avenue for cash liquidation had just been blocked. He had no demolition crew and an active federal flag on his only asset. Naomi stopped pretending to cry for her audience. She lowered her smartphone, her smirk twisting into a mask of malice. She tapped her screen, uploading the video file directly to the internet. She called out loudly, promising to destroy my public reputation right now. Sunday morning arrived with a biting, bitter frost that settled heavily over the city, turning the remaining autumn leaves into fragile shards of glass. I dressed with meticulous care in the quiet solitude of my temporary motel room. I selected a charcoal wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and a muted silk tie. I drove my reliable truck toward the First Zion Fellowship, the heavy diesel engine humming a steady rhythm against the freezing asphalt. Evelyn and I had attended this specific church for over 30 years. We had quietly funded the new slate roof when the old one caved in during a violent winter storm. We had paid for the vibrant stained glass windows illuminating the choir directly from my commercial contracting profits, ensuring our community had a beautiful place to worship. I parked in my usual spot near the eastern entrance. I walked up the wide stone steps and pulled open the heavy, ornate oak doors. The warm, brightly lit vestibule was already crowded with the congregation gathering before the morning service. Usually this space served as a welcoming sanctuary of warm handshakes, respectful nods, and quiet fellowship. Today, the atmosphere shifted the exact second my leather shoes struck the polished hardwood floor. A profound, suffocating silence rolled over the entire crowd like a heavy, toxic fog. The lively chatter died instantly. Men I had personally mentored in business looked down at the floor, refusing to meet my gaze. Women who had wept openly at Evelyn's funeral just days ago suddenly turned their backs to me, shielding their children as if I carried a highly contagious disease. I continued walking down the central aisle toward my usual designated pew in the third row. The silence was broken entirely by the rhythmic heavy strike of my footsteps. I could feel the weight of 100 condemning eyes burning directly into my back. I did not alter my deliberate pace. I maintained my perfectly rigid posture. Before I could reach my seat, Pastor Thomas stepped down from the elevated wooden altar. He was a man I considered a close personal friend, a man who had eaten dinner at my private table just weeks prior to Evelyn's passing. He blocked the narrow aisle, crossing his arms over his ceremonial robes. He did not offer his customary warm handshake or a single word of spiritual comfort. He looked at me with a complex mixture of manufactured sorrow and profound public judgment. He lowered his voice, but the dead silence of the massive sanctuary amplified his spoken words for everyone to hear. He asked me to leave the premises immediately. He stated that my physical presence was a severe disruption to the spiritual peace of his congregation. He pulled his modern smartphone from his suit pocket and held the glowing screen directly up to my face. I looked down at the bright digital display. Naomi's face filled the small screen. She was crying hysterically in a highly produced, heavily edited video broadcast across the internet. The footage was maliciously spliced with out-of-context audio clips of me raising my voice over heavy machinery on a noisy construction site 20 years ago, deliberately manipulated to look like unhinged domestic rage. Her fabricated narrative was absolutely ruthless. She publicly claimed I was a violently abusive father who had secretly squandered her mother's immense wealth through decades of financial incompetence. She told the entire world I was now utilizing corrupt legal loopholes to render my own grieving daughter and her innocent husband entirely homeless out of sheer vindictive malice. The video displayed millions of views. The digital mob had rapidly convicted me, and my own physical community had eagerly accepted the verdict without asking me a single question. The modern world craves endless manufactured drama. This current community deeply respects loud, chaotic displays of public emotion. They readily equate hysterical tears with the absolute, unquestionable truth. My generation learned a fundamentally different lesson about survival. We learned that absolute silence is the ultimate impenetrable armor. When you are a black man building a commercial empire in a corporate world explicitly designed to crush you, any display of raw anger is immediately weaponized against your character. You do not survive the brutal reality of heavy industry by screaming at your detractors. You survive by observing your enemies, calculating your leverage, and acting with surgical, devastating precision. I looked at Pastor Thomas standing in the aisle. I looked at the hundreds of people staring at me from their wooden pews, eagerly waiting for me to snap. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to validate the violent, unstable caricature my daughter had so carefully painted for the world. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not utter a single word of justification to the whispering crowd. Arguing with an irrational mob only feeds their self-righteous hunger for conflict. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. I met the pastor's eyes with a look of absolute freezing clarity. He visibly recoiled, stepping back entirely on his own accord to clear my path. I turned around smoothly. I walked back up the central aisle with slow, deliberate, heavy steps. I kept my chin raised high and my shoulders broad, wearing my absolute dignity like an impenetrable steel shield. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped back out into the cold morning air, leaving their pathetic whispers trapped inside the sanctuary. I walked across the frozen asphalt to my truck and climbed inside the freezing cabin. I did not start the diesel engine immediately. I sat behind the steering wheel, gripping the cold leather rim, letting the absolute isolation of the moment settle over my shoulders. The viral smear campaign was Gavin's desperate, calculated counterattack to the federal injunction Mitchell had filed. Gavin knew he could not beat me in a legitimate court of law, so he deployed Naomi to destroy me in the vicious court of public opinion. My phone vibrated sharply in the center console. The caller identification displayed a secure, encrypted line. It was Mitchell. I answered the call without offering a polite greeting. Mitchell did not waste a single second on standard pleasantries. His voice was incredibly tense, completely stripped of his usual confident corporate bravado. He informed me that his elite forensic accountants had finally cracked the ultimate digital destination of the $2 million Gavin had stolen through the forged bridge loan. The financial reality of the situation was infinitely worse than greedy, impulsive spending on luxury cars or failed tech investments. Mitchell explained that Gavin had funneled the entirety of the stolen funds through a complex, untraceable web of offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. Those specific digital exchanges were directly owned and operated by a highly organized, completely ruthless, illegal gambling syndicate based out of a sovereign island nation. Gavin was a severe chronic gambling addict who had lost millions of dollars of cartel money over the past 3 years. The massive bridge loan was a desperate, panicked attempt to cover his massive criminal debts before the syndicate came looking for blood. Mitchell took a ragged breath and delivered the final horrifying piece of verified intelligence. The syndicate bosses had realized the federal government froze the bank accounts overnight. They had just issued Gavin a final, violently strict deadline to produce their missing money. The sterile legal battle was officially over. A lethal physical war had just arrived directly at my doorstep. Mitchell's secure conference room felt like a concrete bunker buried deep beneath the city streets. The heavy acoustic doors were locked, and the only illumination came from a high-definition projector casting complex financial flowcharts across a massive white screen. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, my hands resting flat on the polished mahogany table, studying the tangled web of red and black lines Mitchell had meticulously mapped out over the past 12 hours. He stood by the screen holding a laser pointer, his face pale under the harsh glare of the projector. He traced a thick red line originating from the forged $2 million bridge loan. The money did not sit in a traditional secret offshore bank account. Gavin had transferred the entire sum into a highly volatile, obscure cryptocurrency exchange operating out of a poorly regulated island nation. Mitchell explained that Gavin was not engaging in investing. He was desperately attempting to launder stolen funds to satisfy an immense existing debt to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate. Gavin had been hemorrhaging cash for 3 years, betting heavily on rigged international sports syndicates and losing with catastrophic consistency. He used the bridge loan to buy digital tokens, intending to transfer the clean, untraceable cryptocurrency directly to the cartel bosses to clear his name. The fatal flaw in his cowardly plan occurred exactly 48 hours after the initial transfer. The obscure crypto exchange collapsed completely under the crushing weight of a sudden federal raid locking all digital assets instantly. The $2 million vanished into the digital ether without a trace. Gavin now stood completely empty-handed before a group of men who did not recognize bankruptcy or bank freezes as valid excuses. He owed $2 million to violent criminals who had just issued a strict lethal deadline. I looked at the projected numbers, absorbing the absolute magnitude of Gavin's stupidity. I realized immediately that my daughter was completely unaware of the syndicate breathing down her husband's neck. Naomi existed in a curated bubble of fabricated wealth, deeply obsessed with maintaining her illusion of luxury for her social circles. She genuinely believed her recent inheritance of the liquid estate would effortlessly fund her lavish lifestyle forever. She did not comprehend that every single asset she possessed was about to be aggressively seized or destroyed by men who operated entirely outside the confines of the law. A lesser man would have immediately gathered this undeniable evidence and walked straight into the local police precinct. A grieving father might have called the authorities to arrest Gavin for fraud and let the traditional criminal justice system handle the rest of the mess. I dismissed that foolish thought the exact moment it crossed my mind. Handing Gavin over to the local police would only shelter him from the immediate physical consequences of his enormous debt. A state prison cell would quickly become a taxpayer sanctuary, protecting him securely from the violent wrath of the syndicate. I absolutely refused to grant him that safety. I survived the brutal, unregulated commercial construction business in the late 80s by mastering the dark art of the corporate chokehold. In those days, corporate survival was not about having the best lawyers or the slickest marketing. It was about discovering exactly what your opponent valued most and acquiring absolute leverage over their survival. I built my massive empire by buying up the vital supply chains of my competitors, forcing them to either submit entirely or starve in the streets. I decided in that dark conference room to apply those same ruthless corporate warfare tactics directly to my own family. I instructed Mitchell to quickly turn off the projector. I leaned forward and outlined my counteroffensive. I told him we were not going to involve law enforcement. Instead, we were going to utilize the vast, untraceable capital locked inside the legacy holding company. I ordered Mitchell to reach out to his deepest underworld contacts and establish a secure, anonymous line of communication with the leadership of the gambling syndicate holding Gavin's markers. I wanted to buy the debt today. Criminal organizations care about capital, not personal family vendettas. If I offered them their missing $2 million plus a substantial 20% premium for their trouble, they would gladly sell the rights to Gavin's life directly to me. I would execute the purchase entirely through a blind trust nested under my holding company. Gavin would never discover that his father-in-law had acquired his markers. I would become his sole, terrifying creditor. I would hold the absolute power to dictate his future, to dismantle his life piece by piece, and to watch him squirm under the crushing weight of a debt he could never repay. Mitchell stared at me for a long moment, a mixture of shock and respect washing over his face. He recognized the ruthlessness of the maneuver. He did not hesitate for a single second. He opened his heavily encrypted laptop and began drafting the complex legal frameworks required to execute an anonymous acquisition of illicit debt through a sanitized corporate proxy. We spent the next 3 hours meticulously structuring the transaction to ensure absolute deniability. I smoothly transferred the required capital from my hidden commercial real estate dividends into a temporary digital escrow account. I sat back and watched the green progress bar on Mitchell's glowing screen as the funds moved silently across secure international routing channels. Mitchell pressed the key to authorize the transfer. He leaned back in his chair and confirmed that the transaction was officially complete. The offshore gambling syndicate had accepted the premium payout and formally relinquished all claims against Gavin. The Legacy Holding Company was now the exclusive owner of Gavin's $2 million debt, complete with all the blackmail material, forged signatures, and collateral agreements the syndicate had gathered against him. I possessed the ultimate power to destroy him legally, financially, and personally at a time of my choosing. The silence of the conference room felt deeply triumphant. I closed my master ledger and slid it back into my leather duffel bag. Less than 2 minutes after the digital ink dried on the debt acquisition, my cell phone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany table. I looked down at the caller identification. It was Naomi. I stared at the bright screen, letting the device ring 4 continuous times before I finally pressed the answer button and raised the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited in absolute silence for her to speak. Her voice came through the speaker completely stripped of its usual extreme arrogance and entitled venom. She sounded remarkably frantic, breathless, and deeply terrified. She forcefully demanded an emergency meeting at a crowded public diner located on the edge of the city limits within the hour. She desperately claimed she needed to speak with me face to face. She promised she was ready to offer a permanent truce. She swore she was acting entirely alone and that Gavin was unaware of her sudden outreach. I listened to her trembling breaths, recognizing the sound of a woman whose fabricated world was fracturing. I did not give her an immediate agreement. I let the silence stretch before I finally verbally accepted. I chose a public diner on the edge of the city limits precisely because it offered no comfort to my daughter. The establishment was a relic of a bygone era, featuring cracked vinyl booths, the heavy scent of old frying oil, and flickering neon lights that cast harsh shadows across the worn laminate tables. I arrived 30 minutes early. I sat in the furthest corner booth, my back pressed firmly against the solid brick wall, giving me a clear line of sight to the main entrance. I ordered a black coffee and waited. I did not touch the steaming mug. I used the time to mentally fortify myself for the impending conversation. The violent ticking clock of the gambling syndicate was now the silent heartbeat of my entire strategy. I held the absolute power to destroy Gavin, but I needed to execute the final blow with flawless timing. The heavy glass door of the diner swung open, letting in a sudden gust of freezing rain. Naomi stepped inside, immediately bringing the quiet murmur of the working-class patrons to a halt. She was a jarring anomaly in this gritty environment. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat, a silk scarf, and carried a designer leather handbag that easily cost more than the monthly wages of the waitress wiping down the counter. Her outfit was entirely funded by the money Gavin had siphoned from her mother's legacy. She scanned the room with visible disgust before her eyes locked onto mine. She did not possess her usual triumphant arrogance. Her posture was rigidly defensive, and her movements carried a frantic, manic energy. She walked over to my booth and slid into the vinyl seat across from me. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was coping with the loss of her mother or the public humiliation she had orchestrated online. She immediately reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stapled inside a blue folder. She slid the papers forcefully across the sticky table. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the signature line on the final page. She informed me that this was a legally binding non-disclosure agreement and a comprehensive asset surrender contract. She spoke rapidly, her voice tight with a desperate edge. She laid out her pathetic terms, framing them as an act of profound mercy from a loving daughter to a disturbed father. In exchange for my signature, she offered me an allowance of exactly $500 a month. She promised to secure a single room for me in a state-subsidized assisted living facility on the industrial side of the city. She stated that I would be fed, housed, and kept out of the cold. In return, I had to immediately drop the federal injunction Mitchell had filed, surrender total ownership of the Legacy Holding Company to Gavin, and sign a notarized medical confession stating I was suffering from early-stage aggressive dementia. She demanded I formally admit that my actions over the past week were the result of severe cognitive decline. I looked at the legal documents, recognizing the sheer desperation radiating from every typed word. Gavin was running out of time. The gambling syndicate was closing in on him, and he was using his wife as a blind shield to secure the only asset that could save his life. Naomi leaned across the table, mistaking my silence for hesitation. She lowered her voice to a vicious whisper, delivering her final threat. She promised that if I refused to sign the confession, she would leverage the viral video she had manufactured to absolute maximum effect. She swore she would go to the national media, utilize every social platform, and ensure the entire world believed I was a violent, abusive monster. She threatened to make me a permanent pariah, guaranteeing that I would die entirely alone, despised by my community, and buried in an unmarked grave. She demanded I take the pen and save myself from total social annihilation. I did not reach for the silver pen she offered. I did not look at the stack of papers. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table. I looked directly into my daughter's eyes with a piercing, unrelenting clarity. I bypassed her entire elaborate legal theater. I ignored her petty threats of public humiliation. I smoothly pushed the blue folder back across the table, stopping it inches from her trembling hands. I spoke in a low, perfectly even tone, stripping away all the noise to deliver a single devastating question. I asked her to tell me exactly where her husband Gavin was on the night her mother suffered her fatal heart attack. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Naomi froze completely. The arrogant sneer vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden violent twitch near her left eye. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Her confident facade shattered into pieces. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words materialized. I watched the profound terror blossom in her eyes as the implications of my question struck her mind. For weeks, Naomi had blindly believed the sanitized narrative that Evelyn had simply passed away peacefully in her sleep while Gavin was supposedly working late at his corporate office. She never questioned the timeline. She never scrutinized the details. My question fundamentally fractured her reality. I possessed a piece of the puzzle she had never even considered. I remembered the final urgent voicemail Evelyn had left on my secure business line just moments before her heart failed. My wife's voice had been tight with shock and fury. She stated clearly that she had caught Gavin in a massive, undeniable financial lie and that she was waiting for him in the study to demand a full confession. Evelyn knew Gavin was stealing. Gavin knew Evelyn had discovered the bridge loan. Naomi suddenly realized that her husband was not safely at his office that night. She realized that I knew exactly what had transpired in the dark hours before the paramedics arrived. The absolute certainty in my voice proved that I held the lethal truth regarding her mother's death. I did not offer her a single word of comfort or clarification. I did not elaborate on the evidence locked inside my basement safe. I let the horrific weight of my question crush her fabricated reality. I stood up from the vinyl booth, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked away from the table. I left her sitting alone in the dingy diner, staring blankly at the worthless non-disclosure agreement. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped back out into the freezing rain. As I walked toward my truck, I glanced back through the wide diner window. Naomi was no longer looking at the papers. She had her smartphone pressed tightly against her ear, frantically pacing next to the booth. She was calling Gavin in a state of absolute unhinged panic. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. I knew exactly how Gavin would react to that phone call. Gavin would instantly realize that his meticulous cover-up had failed. He would realize that the dementia narrative was no longer sufficient. He would conclude that I knew entirely too much about his financial crimes and his direct role in Evelyn's death. I was no longer an inconvenience to be managed in a courtroom. I was a lethal threat to his freedom and his life. He could not afford to let me speak to the authorities. He had to silence me permanently and immediately. I drove back to the cheap, secluded motel where I had taken temporary residence. I spent the night awake, sitting in the dark, fully prepared for Gavin's inevitable retaliation. I did not have to wait long. The very next morning, just as the pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the thin motel curtains, the heavy crunch of tires on loose gravel broke the silence. A large, windowless white van pulled up slowly and parked directly in front of my door, blocking my only exit. The heavy side doors swung open with a metallic screech. Two massively built men stepped out onto the wet pavement. They were not wearing the sharp suits of corporate bodyguards. They were wearing sterile white medical uniforms. They moved with a chilling, predatory purpose, walking straight toward my room. The end game was here. The heavy fist pounded against the cheap veneer of my motel room door with a violent, rhythmic urgency that rattled the brass hinges. The blows were not designed to request entry. They were designed to induce immediate panic. I did not rush. I smoothed the lapels of my dark charcoal suit, checked the secure lock screen on my smartphone, and walked deliberately across the faded carpet. I unfastened the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The freezing morning air rushed into the stifling room, carrying the sharp scent of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. The two massively built men in sterile white medical uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder, effectively blocking any physical avenue of escape. Their posture was aggressively territorial. They possessed the thick, scarred knuckles and flat eyes of men who were entirely accustomed to using blunt physical force to resolve administrative problems. Standing directly between them was a third man. He wore a slick, overly tailored pinstripe suit that clashed violently with the gritty aesthetic of the roadside motel. He carried a polished leather briefcase and an aura of manufactured bureaucratic authority. The man in the pinstripe suit did not wait for an invitation. He forcefully stepped across the threshold, invading my private space with practiced arrogance. The two orderlies immediately stepped in behind him, closing the door and trapping me inside the cramped, dimly lit room. The slick man introduced himself as a state-appointed medical evaluator. His voice was incredibly smooth, polished by years of delivering devastating news with absolute clinical detachment. He reached into his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper bearing a golden municipal seal. He held it out, though he deliberately kept it just out of my physical reach. He claimed he was executing an emergency expedited court order signed by a sitting district judge late last night. He stated in a tone dripping with fabricated sympathy that I was being taken into immediate involuntary psychiatric custody. He claimed the court had received highly credible sworn testimony that I was suffering from severe, rapidly progressing delusions. He explicitly cited my recent actions at the construction site and the public incident at the church as definitive proof of highly erratic, potentially violent behavior. I listened to his rehearsed monologue with absolute freezing silence. The strategy was brutally efficient and completely predictable. Gavin knew he could not simply murder me in a cheap motel without drawing the immediate, overwhelming wrath of the federal investigators already scrutinizing his life. Instead, he opted for the ultimate institutional silencing. A locked psychiatric ward would entirely strip me of my legal autonomy, instantly nullify any claims I made regarding his immense financial crimes, and grant Naomi total control over my remaining assets under the guise of medical conservatorship. I had survived the ruthless, cutthroat business practices of the late 80s by mastering the art of anticipating the exact moment an opponent would break the law to survive. When a corporate rival is backed into a lethal corner, they always reach for the fastest, most corrupt shortcut available. I applied those exact corporate warfare tactics to my own family. I knew Gavin would seek out corrupt municipal officials the absolute second Naomi realized I possessed the truth about Evelyn's final night. I did not leave my safety to chance. 3 days ago, I instructed Mitchell to contact his most aggressive, highly connected private investigator. I paid the operative triple his usual exorbitant rate to shadow Gavin 24 hours a day, utilizing military-grade surveillance equipment. I demanded absolute visual control over every single interaction Gavin had. The state-appointed evaluator finished his prepared speech. He nodded sharply to the two massive men flanking the door. The orderlies stepped forward simultaneously. Their thick hands reached out, preparing to physically restrain my arms and drag me forcefully toward the idling white van outside. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to fight two men who were biologically engineered for physical submission. I took one smooth, calculated step backward, creating exactly 2 feet of essential distance. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I held the device up, rotating the high-definition screen so it was perfectly visible to the slick evaluator. I did not say a single word of defense. I simply pressed play. The bright digital screen illuminated the dim motel room. The footage was crystal clear, captured in pristine 4K resolution by a hidden long-range telephoto lens. The video showed the bleak concrete interior of a subterranean parking garage. The timestamp glowed brightly in the bottom corner, indicating the event had occurred less than 12 hours ago, shortly after midnight. The man in the pinstripe suit appeared on the screen, stepping out of a dark luxury sedan. A moment later, Gavin walked into the frame. Gavin looked frantic, sweating heavily despite the cold, concrete environment. The audio was remarkably crisp, captured by a highly sensitive directional microphone. The entire room listened as Gavin's panicked voice echoed from the small speaker. Gavin explicitly begged the evaluator to expedite the psychiatric hold, explicitly stating that I possessed information that could utterly destroy his life. Gavin handed the evaluator a thick, heavy manila envelope. The evaluator on the screen opened the flap, revealing tightly packed stacks of $100 bills. He smiled, tucked the cash into his tailored jacket, and promised Gavin that the old man would be permanently locked in a padded room by sunrise. The electronic audio of the bribe echoed against the cheap motel walls. The absolute suffocating silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the foundation. I lowered the phone. I looked directly into the evaluator's eyes. The arrogant, bureaucratic superiority instantly vanished from his face. All the blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickening shade of ash gray. He stared at the dark screen of my phone, fully comprehending the catastrophic magnitude of the digital file. He was a man who made a highly lucrative living abusing the medical system for cash, and he had just watched his entire professional career, his personal freedom, and his completely fraudulent life evaporate in less than 30 seconds. He knew that the video was not just evidence of a bribe. It was absolute, undeniable proof of a coordinated criminal conspiracy to kidnap a federal witness. If that specific video reached the district attorney, he would spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. The 2 massive orderlies halted their advance. They looked at the evaluator, waiting for their next brutal command, entirely unaware of the lethal legal trap that had just snapped shut around their boss. The evaluator did not order them forward. He began to physically tremble. He took a rapid, stumbling step backward, bumping heavily into the wooden door frame. He raised a shaking hand and frantically ordered his men to retreat. He did not attempt to seize my phone. He did not attempt to negotiate. He simply wanted to escape the immediate blast radius of his own catastrophic mistake. He grabbed the brass door handle, yanked it open, and practically sprinted out into the freezing rain. The 2 orderlies exchanged a highly confused glance before turning and rushing out after him. I stood in the doorway and watched them scramble into the windowless white van. The engine roared to life, the tires spinning wildly against the wet gravel as they fled the motel parking lot, leaving deep, muddy grooves in their wake. I closed the motel door and engaged the heavy steel deadbolt. I walked calmly back to the small desk in the corner of the room. I tapped the screen of my smartphone, attaching the high-definition video file to a highly encrypted, secure messaging application. I selected Mitchell's contact profile and hit send. The progress bar filled instantly. We now possessed the ultimate, irrefutable proof of a coordinated criminal conspiracy. Gavin had crossed the final unforgivable line. He had actively attempted to weaponize the state medical apparatus to eliminate me. I watched the delivery confirmation icon illuminate on the screen. Less than a minute later, Mitchell replied with a single, highly decisive sentence. He was filing an immediate emergency federal hearing. We were going to drag Gavin out of the shadows and force him into the blinding light of an open court. The time for silent maneuvering was officially over. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing the humid air inside the expansive room. The polished mahogany benches gleamed under the recessed lighting, reflecting the absolute gravity of the impending legal battle. I sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, my hands resting flat against the cool wood, wearing my darkest tailored suit. Mitchell sat directly to my right, arranging his pristine folders with the surgical precision of a corporate executioner. Across the wide center aisle, Gavin and Naomi occupied the defense table. They projected an aura of absolute, untouchable confidence. They sat beside an arrogant defense attorney whose designer suit clearly cost more than a standard demolition contract. Naomi dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, perfectly maintaining her fabricated posture of a heartbroken daughter. Gavin sat rigidly, his jaw clenched silently, celebrating what he foolishly believed was his imminent financial salvation. He completely believed his rapid maneuver to secure a conservatorship would legally erase my existence before the syndicate deadline expired. The presiding judge, an older man with a reputation for absolute intolerance regarding courtroom theatrics, struck his wooden gavel to commence the emergency hearing. The defense attorney immediately seized the floor. He did not rely on legal precedent or financial documentation. He relied entirely on weaponized emotion. He activated the large digital monitors positioned around the courtroom and played the viral video Naomi had recorded at the estate. My face filled the screen, standing silently in front of the massive yellow bulldozer. The attorney aggressively narrated the footage, claiming that my stoic refusal to move was undeniable proof of severe, rapidly progressing mental instability. He painted a horrifying, completely fabricated picture of a violent, detached father who secretly squandered his late wife's immense fortune and was now trying to render his own daughter homeless out of vindictive malice. He dramatically submitted a stack of sworn affidavits, forged testimonies from corrupted medical associates and paid neighbors, all claiming they had witnessed my rapid cognitive decline. He concluded his theatrical presentation by requesting that the court strip me of all legal autonomy. He demanded that Gavin be immediately appointed as the full permanent conservator over my life and remaining assets. The judge leaned forward, his stern expression softening slightly as he looked down at Naomi's carefully manufactured silent tears. I did not react. I did not shift in my chair or glare at the defense table. I knew that arguing with a highly paid liar in an open courtroom only serves to validate their false narrative. Mitchell stood up. He did not mirror the defense attorney's loud, aggressive volume. He did not offer a single word of emotional rebuttal. He operated entirely on the lethal frequency of undeniable facts. Mitchell approached the bench and smoothly presented a sealed folder bearing the official crest of the state's most prestigious neurological hospital. I had anticipated their strategy long before they formulated their attack. The morning after Evelyn's funeral, while my daughter was shopping for mourning dresses with stolen funds, I drove directly to the hospital's neurology wing. I knew exactly how greedy heirs operated. I knew my sanity would be their primary target. I spent 4 exhausting hours undergoing rigorous cognitive mapping, memory stress tests, and extensive psychiatric evaluations by medical professionals. I secured an absolute medically certified shield of sanity before Gavin even realized he needed a weapon. Mitchell handed the certified documents directly to the judge. Mitchell stated that the medical records proved I possessed flawless cognitive function scoring in the highest possible percentile for a man of any age. The defense attorney scoffed loudly, objecting to the documents and claiming they were insufficient to dismiss the sworn affidavits of concerned family members. Mitchell did not argue with the man. He turned toward the court clerk and requested permission to submit audiovisual Exhibit B directly to the courtroom monitors. The judge granted the request. The monitors flickered, replacing the viral video with the high-definition footage captured by Mitchell's private investigator. The concrete walls of the municipal parking garage appeared on the screens. The crisp audio filled the silent courtroom. Gavin walked into the frame, his face slick with sweat. The court watched in paralyzed silence as Gavin approached the medical evaluator. They listened as Gavin aggressively begged the official to expedite my psychiatric hold. He explicitly stated that I possessed dangerous information that could destroy his life. The video showed Gavin handing over the thick manila envelope packed with $100 bills. They watched the evaluator smile, pocket the bribe, and promise to lock me in a padded room by sunrise. The digital playback ended, leaving the final frame frozen on Gavin's terrified face. The atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted so violently it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked through the ventilation grates. Naomi dropped her silk handkerchief. Her constructed facade of a grieving daughter shattered into a million pieces. She stared at the frozen monitor in absolute horror. She was completely unaware of the gambling syndicate, and she was equally unaware that her husband was bribing public officials to orchestrate a kidnapping. She realized in that exact second that the man next to her was committing federal felonies. The judge's face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. The sympathetic softness he had shown Naomi completely evaporated, replaced by the lethal rage of a magistrate who had just been aggressively lied to in his own courtroom. He slammed his wooden gavel down with a violent, explosive crack that made the defense attorney physically flinch. The judge did not mince words. He immediately dismissed the conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice. He leaned over the heavy wooden bench, pointing a shaking finger directly at Gavin. He warned the boy that he was officially referring the video evidence to the district attorney. He explicitly stated that impending felony charges for perjury, bribery, and criminal conspiracy were unavoidable. He ordered the bailiffs to secure the doors and contact the federal authorities immediately. Gavin completely snapped. The crushing reality of the syndicate's lethal deadline colliding with an imminent federal arrest overloaded his desperate mind. Survival instinct completely overrode his manufactured corporate decorum. He leaped up from the defense table, his heavy wooden chair crashing violently against the mahogany railing. He grabbed Naomi roughly by the arm, his fingers digging into her expensive white coat. He leaned in and whispered frantically, his voice carrying clearly across the silent aisle. He told his wife they needed to pack their bags and flee to their luxury downtown penthouse before the federal marshals arrived to seize their passports. He did not wait for the judge to formally dismiss them. He dragged Naomi toward the heavy oak doors, sprinting down the center aisle to escape his own catastrophic failure. The defense attorney remained frozen at the table, rapidly packing his briefcase to distance himself from his radioactive clients. I remained seated at the plaintiff's table, perfectly still. I adjusted my silk tie and watched them run. I offered a cold, highly calculated smile to the empty space they left behind. Gavin truly believed that running to his multi-million-dollar high-rise penthouse would offer him a temporary sanctuary from the law and the cartel. He was running directly into the final inescapable trap I had personally built for him. Gavin drove his luxury sports car through the slick city streets with the reckless desperation of a hunted animal. He bypassed the valet entirely, screeching into the private underground parking garage of the towering glass high-rise. He dragged Naomi toward the secure private elevator, his hands shaking so violently he could barely scan his biometric access card. The stainless steel doors slid shut, sealing them inside the rapidly ascending metal box. Gavin truly believed this building was his ultimate sanctuary. He believed the heavy reinforced doors and the elite private security team in the lobby would buy him the crucial hours he needed to pack his hidden cash reserves, secure their international passports, and charter a private flight out of the country before the federal marshals mobilized. They burst into the sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse. The expansive living room was a monument to fabricated wealth, featuring imported Italian marble floors, custom velvet furniture, and floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows offering a breathtaking view of the gray skyline. Gavin did not pause to admire the view. He sprinted directly into the master bedroom and violently tore open the walk-in closet doors. He ordered Naomi to grab the largest designer suitcases they owned and pack only the absolute necessities. He frantically swept his collection of luxury watches and expensive cufflinks into a leather duffel bag. Naomi stood completely paralyzed near the doorway. She demanded an explanation. She screamed at him, begging to know why the federal government was suddenly involved and why my lawyer had a video of him bribing a medical official. Gavin ignored her frantic questions. He shouted at her to shut up and pack her diamond jewelry if she did not want to spend the rest of her life in a federal penitentiary. Before Naomi could move a single muscle, a sharp, incredibly loud knock echoed through the massive apartment. The heavy rhythmic pounding struck the solid oak double doors of the penthouse entrance. Gavin froze instantly. The expensive gold watch he was holding slipped from his trembling fingers and crashed against the hardwood floor. All the color drained from his face. He stared at the bedroom doorway, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He was completely certain that a squad of armed federal agents was standing on the other side of the door, holding a battering ram and a federal arrest warrant. He crept slowly down the wide hallway, moving with absolute paralyzing terror. He reached the entryway and checked the digital security monitor. His tense shoulders dropped slightly. It was not the police. It was a single man in a beige trench coat, flanked by the building's head of security and two heavily muscled private guards. Gavin unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, attempting to summon his usual arrogant corporate authority. The man in the trench coat did not ask for permission to speak. He was a highly efficient state-licensed process server. He stepped forward and shoved a thick, legally binding document directly into Naomi's hands, bypassing Gavin entirely. The server spoke in a loud, monotonous voice, officially declaring that they were being served with an immediate, non-negotiable eviction notice. He stated that the property was legally reclaimed and they had less than 5 minutes to vacate the premises entirely. Naomi stared at the legal documents in absolute bewilderment. Her confusion rapidly morphed into explosive outrage. She stepped forward and screamed directly into the process server's face. She claimed the eviction was a complete, absurd mistake. She shouted that they were the sole legitimate owners of the penthouse and that her husband had purchased the luxury unit completely outright years ago. The process server did not flinch. He calmly reached forward and flipped the blue folder in Naomi's hands to the second page. He tapped his pen firmly against the attached property deed and the highlighted signature lines. He instructed her to read the registered owner's name aloud. Naomi looked down at the highlighted text. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. The penthouse was not owned by Gavin. The property deed clearly stated that the entire luxury unit, along with the entire glass high-rise building itself, was wholly owned and operated by the Legacy Holding Company. 10 years ago, I recognized a prime commercial real estate opportunity and quietly purchased the entire residential tower through my anonymous corporate entity. When Gavin first started dating my daughter, he wanted to desperately impress her with his fabricated financial brilliance. He told Naomi he had purchased the sprawling penthouse unit with the massive profits from a highly successful tech startup he founded. It was a complete, calculated lie. Gavin never owned a single square foot of the property. He had simply signed a standard residential lease agreement with my holding company. He had been quietly paying me exorbitant monthly rent for years, desperately hiding the financial drain from Naomi to maintain his illusion of massive wealth. However, when the offshore gambling syndicate began aggressively demanding their payments, Gavin's financial juggling act collapsed. He stopped paying his residential rent to funnel every available dollar toward his illegal debts. He completely defaulted on 3 consecutive months of hidden rent payments. My commercial leases contain a brutal, highly specific forfeiture clause. Missing 90 days of rent triggers an immediate absolute eviction protocol with zero requirement for a lengthy municipal court battle. Naomi slowly turned her head and looked at her husband. The absolute magnitude of his deception finally shattered the last remaining pieces of her fabricated reality. The luxury penthouse, the designer clothes, the arrogant social status, all of it was a pathetic, heavily mortgaged illusion. Gavin backed away from her, his hands raised defensively, stammering out a pathetic string of broken excuses. The head of building security stepped across the threshold, cutting off Gavin's pathetic apologies. The security chief was a man who strictly followed corporate orders, and my holding company paid his massive salary. He informed Gavin and Naomi that their 5 minutes were officially over. He stated that they were legally trespassing on private corporate property. He pointed to the 2 designer suitcases sitting in the hallway and informed them they could take exactly what was already packed. Everything else inside the penthouse now legally belonged to the holding company to cover the massive outstanding rental debts. Naomi shrieked, lunging toward the bedroom to retrieve her expensive coats. The 2 security guards immediately stepped forward, blocking her path with their large frames. They grabbed Gavin by the shoulders and physically shoved him out into the private elevator lobby. Naomi was forced out right behind him, crying hysterically as the heavy oak doors of the penthouse slammed shut and automatically locked, echoing with a definitive metallic finality. The security guards escorted them down the elevator in absolute silence. They dragged the 2 suitcases through the pristine marble lobby and pushed my daughter and her husband out the front glass doors. The freezing torrential rain hit them immediately. They stood on the wet, unforgiving concrete sidewalk, stripped of their shelter, their wealth, and their entire fabricated identities. Naomi hugged her arms across her chest, her expensive white cashmere coat instantly soaked and ruined by the heavy downpour. She glared at Gavin with a look of pure, concentrated hatred. Before she could utter a single word of vitriol, a sharp electronic vibration interrupted the sound of the falling rain. Gavin reached into his wet pocket and pulled out his smartphone. The caller identification displayed a restricted, untraceable international number. Gavin's hand shook so violently he almost dropped the device into a muddy puddle on the pavement. He swiped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear, his face draining of whatever color it had left. I had deliberately ensured the syndicate possessed a direct audio feed of the municipal courtroom proceedings through one of Mitchell's hidden operatives. The violent cartel bosses had listened to the judge completely dismiss the conservatorship. They knew Gavin had failed to secure my assets. The low, menacing voice on the other end of the line did not offer any room for negotiations. The syndicate explicitly informed Gavin that his time had completely run out. They demanded their $2 million be delivered to a secure location by midnight tonight. If the money was not physically present, they would not bother calling a second time. The voice disconnected, leaving Gavin staring blankly into the freezing storm. The trap had closed perfectly around him. He was completely out of time, completely out of money, and entirely at my mercy. The midnight storm battered the sprawling main estate with a relentless and freezing fury. Sheets of heavy rain lashed against the large bay windows of the primary living room, distorting the minimal light into long and watery shadows across the floor. I sat completely motionless in my tall leather armchair, engulfed in the absolute darkness of the cavernous room. I did not require any illumination to know the precise layout of my surroundings. I had built this house and I had recently fortified it. On the exact night I reclaimed the property from Gavin's illegal demolition crew, I quietly authorized a massive and comprehensive upgrade to the internal surveillance network. I hired a private security firm specializing in corporate espionage to wire the entire estate. They installed concealed premium cameras in every hallway, biometric sensors on every primary access point, and reinforced the exterior perimeter with advanced motion detectors. The entire property was a digital fortress, operating on a closed and heavily encrypted server that uploaded instantly to Mitchell's secure cloud framework. I knew Gavin was out of time, out of money, and completely out of rational options. The offshore gambling syndicate had demanded their $2 million by midnight. It was currently 10 minutes past the hour. Gavin was a desperate hunted animal, and hunted animals invariably return to the only territory they believe they can still conquer. I simply waited in the shadows, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the storm, perfectly prepared for the violent collision that was about to unfold. The initial perimeter alert vibrated silently against my wrist. My smartwatch displayed a single glowing red notification indicating a perimeter breach near the eastern rose garden. 30 seconds later, a violent explosive crash shattered the quiet isolation of the living room. A heavy landscaping brick smashed directly through the center pane of the primary bay window. Shards of thick tempered glass rained down onto the imported Persian rug like jagged glittering ice. The freezing wind howled through the jagged opening, violently snapping the heavy velvet curtains inward. Two hands clad in soaked leather gloves gripped the ruined window frame. Gavin pulled his upper body through the broken glass, tearing the sleeve of his expensive designer raincoat on a sharp, protruding shard. He tumbled heavily onto the living room floor, gasping for air, bringing the stench of wet earth and raw panic into my home. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving uncontrollably. He gripped a solid steel tire iron in his right hand. His hair was plastered to his forehead by the freezing rain, and his eyes darted around the dark room with the frantic, unhinged energy of a man completely devoid of sanity. He was no longer the arrogant, polished tech executive who had sneered at me in the corporate lobby. He was a cornered, terrified criminal preparing to cross the ultimate irreversible boundary. Gavin swung the heavy steel tire iron through the dark air, smashing it violently against a nearby mahogany end table. The wood splintered instantly, the sharp crack echoing loudly over the storm outside. He screamed my name into the shadows, his voice cracking under the immense, lethal pressure exerted by the offshore gambling syndicate. He demanded that I stand up and face him. He commanded me to turn over the legal ownership of the Legacy Holding Company immediately. He paced erratically across the ruined glass, his breathing ragged and shallow. He explicitly threatened to beat me to death right there on the floor. He laid out his entire pathetic criminal strategy with the reckless bravado of a coward holding a weapon. He claimed he would forcefully extract my signature on the asset transfer documents, bludgeon me into an unrecognizable state, and then completely ransack the estate to frame the murder as a random, tragic home invasion. He genuinely believed that the local police would accept the narrative of a violent burglary gone wrong. He believed he could silence the only man holding his illegal debts and instantly secure the capital required to satisfy the ruthless syndicate bosses waiting for their money. He took 2 aggressive steps forward, raising the heavy steel bar above his shoulder, preparing to strike the moment he located my position in the darkness. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into the upholstery of my armchair or beg a violent criminal for my life. I simply reached into the right pocket of my tailored trousers and retrieved a small, customized keychain remote. I pressed my thumb firmly against the primary activation button. The entire living room flooded with blinding, intense security lights. 4 massive industrial halogen bulbs mounted discreetly in the ceiling corners ignited simultaneously, stripping away the shadows and exposing Gavin in stark, unforgiving detail. He cried out in sudden pain, dropping his free hand to shield his eyes from the overwhelming glare. Before he could adjust to the sudden illumination, a loud recorded electronic voice boomed through the concealed surround speakers. The automated system explicitly announced that a severe perimeter breach had been detected. Armed police units had already been dispatched to the exact coordinates of the estate, and the entire immediate area was currently under live encrypted digital surveillance. The mechanical voice echoed with absolute, chilling authority, bouncing off the walls and completely drowning out the sound of the raging storm outside. I remained seated in my armchair, my hands resting calmly on the armrests. I looked directly at Gavin, watching the absolute realization of his catastrophic failure crush the remaining breath from his lungs. He was trapped in a brilliantly lit, heavily fortified room surrounded by hidden cameras capturing his every movement in pristine detail. The heavy steel tire iron slipped from Gavin's trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Overwhelming terror finally paralyzed his nervous system. He stared at the flashing red indicator lights mounted on the ceiling. He knew law enforcement was minutes away. He knew the gambling syndicate was actively hunting him down. He realized he had just handed me the weapon to destroy his freedom forever. Gavin did not attempt to negotiate. He turned around, scrambled desperately back over the shattered window frame, and fled into the freezing rain like a coward, abandoning his weapon in the mud. I did not move to chase him. I remained in my chair, pulling my smartphone from my pocket. I accessed the secure application linked to the internal surveillance network and pulled up the live feed. I reviewed the pristine premium video footage of the intrusion. The digital file clearly displayed Gavin violently smashing the window, entering my home with a deadly weapon, and loudly articulating his premeditated plan to murder me. I now had Gavin trapped for armed burglary, attempted murder, and extortion. I possessed the power to send him to prison for life. However, locking him in a cell now would be too merciful. I downloaded the encrypted footage and sent a secure copy directly to Mitchell for safekeeping. I decided in that moment to let Gavin remain loose in the world for just a little while longer. I would allow him to attempt his final, most foolish plan before I dropped the ultimate hammer. The afternoon sunlight did little to dispel the chilling reality of Gavin's situation. He had chosen an opulent, overly air-conditioned conference room on the second floor of a high-end downtown hotel for his final desperate maneuver. He sat across a wide mahogany table from a man whose reputation for aggressive land acquisition was well known in commercial circles. The foreign developer wore a bespoke suit that cost more than a luxury sedan and possessed the cold, calculating eyes of a predator accustomed to feeding on distressed assets. Gavin was attempting to project his usual polished corporate arrogance, but the cracks in his facade were glaringly obvious. His tie was slightly askew. A thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting of the boardroom. He spoke too quickly, pushing a thick stack of documents across the polished wood surface with trembling hands. These were the forged deeds to my 70-acre estate. Gavin was laying out the terms of a catastrophic fire sale. He was offering the pristine, highly coveted land for a fraction of its actual market value. He demanded only one absolute condition. He required an immediate, non-refundable $2 million wire transfer to a specified offshore account. The foreign developer did not immediately reach for the papers. He steepled his fingers and stared at Gavin with naked suspicion. The price was absurdly low, representing a massive financial loss for the seller. Commercial real estate transactions of this magnitude required weeks of meticulous due diligence, environmental surveys, and municipal approvals. Gavin was demanding a blind, instantaneous exchange of capital. The developer knew he was looking at a highly irregular, legally questionable arrangement. However, the sheer scale of the potential profit was blinding. The developer's greed was rapidly overriding his professional caution. He leaned forward slowly, pulling the forged deeds closer to his side of the table, his eyes scanning the fraudulent municipal seals and fabricated signatures. Naomi sat rigidly next to Gavin, trapped in a waking nightmare. She was physically sweating, her chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. She had followed Gavin to the hotel in a state of numb shock after our violent encounter at the estate. She had believed his frantic promises that he possessed a secret corporate asset that could save them from the syndicate. Sitting in the sterile conference room, she finally understood the catastrophic scale of her husband's crimes. He was not selling a hidden startup investment. He was actively attempting to steal and liquidate her father's entire legacy through massive, undeniable forgery. She watched him lie to the foreign developer, her mind reeling from the sheer audacity of the federal felony occurring right in front of her. She realized that Gavin was not merely a corrupt businessman. He was a cornered, dangerous criminal perfectly willing to burn down the entire world to save his own life. She wanted to scream, to run out of the room to distance herself from the radioactive blast radius of his actions, but she was completely paralyzed by terror. The gambling syndicate's midnight deadline was ticking away in her head like a lethal metronome. The foreign developer finished reviewing the final page of the fraudulent deed. He looked up, locking eyes with Gavin. He did not ask any further questions regarding the absurdly low price or the frantic timeline. He simply reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket and produced a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. He uncapped the pen with a smooth, practiced motion and positioned the tip directly above the signature line on the International Wire Transfer Authorization form. Gavin held his breath. His eyes were wide and frantic, completely fixated on the gold pen. He was mere seconds away from securing the exact amount of cash required to satisfy the ruthless cartel bosses and secure his own survival. Just as the gold nib touched the crisp white paper, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open with a forceful, commanding crash. I walked into the room wearing my perfectly tailored dark suit. I projected absolute, uncompromising authority. Mitchell stepped into the room directly behind me, moving with the cold, lethal precision of a predator arriving at a designated kill site. We did not arrive by accident or coincidence. Mitchell maintained a vast, highly lucrative network of informants deeply embedded within the city's commercial real estate sector. The very moment Gavin desperately attempted to circulate the illegal underground listing for my property, Mitchell's contacts intercepted the digital communication. We had monitored the entire fraudulent transaction from its inception. We knew exactly who Gavin was meeting, precisely where the clandestine negotiation was taking place, and the exact dollar amount he was attempting to extort. We had simply waited for Gavin to physically present the forged documents, allowing him to commit the federal felony completely before executing our intervention. Gavin violently jerked back in his chair. The false corporate bravado instantly evaporated from his face, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He looked at me as if I were a ghost materializing from the shadows to collect a blood debt. Naomi gasped loudly, pressing her trembling hands tightly over her mouth to stifle a scream. The foreign developer froze instantly, the heavy gold pen hovering mere inches above the crucial document. He looked rapidly between Gavin's terrified, sweating expression and my calm, commanding presence. He possessed enough survival instinct to recognize that the highly lucrative transaction had just become a catastrophic legal liability. I did not raise my voice to address the panic in the room. I did not acknowledge Gavin's frantic breathing or my daughter's complete emotional collapse. I walked smoothly and deliberately to the center of the wide mahogany table. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my suit jacket and produced the true, original, legally certified deed to the 70-acre estate. The heavy parchment bore the authentic municipal watermarks and the undeniable proof of my sole ownership. I placed the genuine document firmly on the polished wood surface directly next to Gavin's pathetic fabricated papers. I looked directly into the foreign developer's eyes with a piercing, unrelenting clarity. I informed him in a low, perfectly even tone that the desperate man sitting across from him was a heavily indebted fraud who did not own a single blade of grass on that property. I explicitly stated that the lucrative documents he was currently reviewing were massive, undeniable forgeries designed to fund an illegal gambling syndicate. I warned the developer that if his gold pen touched that authorization form, he would instantly cross the fatal threshold from a greedy businessman into a willing documented accessory to a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud conspiracy. I promised him that Mitchell would personally ensure his entire offshore corporate empire was dragged into a ruthless federal indictment. The entire conference room fell dead silent. The heavy air conditioning hummed quietly above us, amplifying the absolute finality of my devastating statement. Gavin's final, pathetic lifeline had just been completely severed, leaving him entirely exposed to the violent syndicate. He was completely out of time, realizing he lost the war. The foreign developer did not blink. He slowly lowered his heavy gold fountain pen, placing it deliberately on the dark mahogany table. He reached across the polished surface and pulled my original deed toward him with practiced caution. He placed it directly adjacent to the documents Gavin had aggressively provided just moments before. The conference room became incredibly silent. The faint mechanical hum of the overhead ventilation system sounded like a roaring engine in the suffocating quiet. The developer possessed a practiced surgical eye for commercial real estate contracts and multi-million-dollar acquisitions. He meticulously compared the two sets of paperwork. He ran his manicured fingers over the thick premium parchment of my document, physically feeling the raised authentic texture of the municipal seals and the deeply pressed signature lines. He then picked up Gavin's forged deed and held it directly up to the harsh, bright fluorescent lighting of the boardroom. The discrepancy was glaringly obvious to anyone who knew exactly what to look for in secure legal documentation. Decades ago, during my early, highly lucrative contracting days, I had personally designed the security watermarks for my corporate holding company. I utilized a highly specific proprietary pressing technique that embedded microscopic geometric patterns directly into the fiber of the paper itself. I knew from sheer experience that standard commercial printers and ambitious amateur forgers could never replicate that exact structural integrity. The developer held Gavin's document to the light and saw nothing but flat, lifeless standard-issue paper. He turned his cold, predatory gaze slowly toward Gavin. The developer realized instantly that he had been seconds away from wiring $2 million into a black hole of federal wire fraud and international conspiracy. Gavin felt the developer's lethal glare and completely unraveled right in front of us. The polished, arrogant tech executive persona he had cultivated for years instantly melted away, leaving behind a terrified, stammering child. He leaped out of his luxurious leather chair, leaning heavily over the wide conference table. He frantically waved his hands, desperately trying to construct a believable lie out of thin air. He claimed the glaring discrepancy was merely a minor clerical error at the county records office. He loudly insisted that his incompetent lawyers had simply printed the binding contract on the wrong legal stationery, and that the core financial transaction was entirely legitimate. Sweat poured down his face in heavy streams, rapidly soaking the stiff collar of his expensive designer shirt. His voice cracked with raw, pathetic desperation, destroying any illusion of control. He explicitly begged the developer to ignore the paperwork issue and push the massive wire transfer through immediately. He wildly promised to sign binding personal guarantees, offered an even steeper, illogical discount on the pristine 70-acre estate, and swore on his life he would provide updated, verified municipal files by the end of the current week. He practically threw his upper body across the table, his eyes wide with the maniacal terror of a man who knew the offshore gambling syndicate was rapidly closing the distance between them. He pleaded for the $2 million with a sickening, groveling intensity, entirely abandoning any remaining semblance of professional dignity or self-respect. The foreign developer did not entertain a single word of Gavin's frantic, improvised lies. He stood up from his chair with a sudden, violent energy that knocked the heavy leather seat backward until it slammed into the wall. His face transformed into a deep, furious shade of crimson. He fully grasped the catastrophic magnitude of the legal trap he had almost stepped into blindly. Wiring millions of dollars to a fraudulent, non-existent entity across international lines would have instantly flagged his entire global development corporation for a massive, inescapable federal investigation. The developer reached forcefully across the table and snatched Gavin's forged contract from the wood surface. He gripped the thick stack of fraudulent papers in both hands and violently tore them right down the middle. He did not simply drop the ruined documents in disgust. He threw the torn pieces directly into Gavin's sweating, panicked face with explosive force. The ripped pages fluttered chaotically through the air, scattering across the polished mahogany table and falling uselessly onto the plush carpet below. The developer leaned forward, placing his large, heavily ringed hands flat on the table, aggressively invading Gavin's physical space. He spoke in a low, thunderous voice that completely filled the silent room. He promised Gavin that he would personally ensure every single financial institution, private equity firm, and land development agency in the entire state received a highly detailed, verified warning about this attempted fraud. He swore he would utterly blacklist Gavin from the commercial business sector, permanently ensuring he could never secure another legitimate commercial loan again. He grabbed his solid gold fountain pen, snapped his leather briefcase shut with a sharp crack, and stormed angrily out of the conference room. His entire legal team immediately followed his aggressive exit, their rapid footsteps echoing loudly down the hotel corridor as they fled the radioactive legal disaster. Gavin stood completely frozen at the edge of the conference table, resembling a hollow statue. He stared blankly down at the torn pieces of his fraudulent contract scattered across the expensive floor. He did not move to pick them up. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths, but he remained utterly, terrifyingly silent. The absolute finality of his bleak situation crushed the remaining air from his lungs. He had zero money remaining in his accounts. He had no property to leverage. He had no viable escape route left on the board. His final desperate maneuver had failed catastrophically in front of multiple witnesses. He was trapped in an inescapable corner, fully exposed to the lethal, uncompromising deadline imposed by the offshore gambling syndicate. Naomi remained seated rigidly in her chair, physically trembling from head to toe. She looked up at her husband with an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. The thick, comforting fog of her manufactured, wealthy lifestyle finally cleared, revealing the devastating truth of her marriage. For years, she had blindly believed she was married to a brilliant, highly successful tech entrepreneur. She had proudly flaunted her designer clothes, her luxury penthouse, and her elite social status, entirely convinced of her own unassailable superiority. Now, staring directly at the sweating, pathetic man standing defeated over the torn forgeries, she finally understood the grim reality of her existence. Gavin was not a wealthy, powerful businessman. He was a pathetic, heavily indebted criminal who had actively attempted to steal her father's entire legacy just to save his own miserable life. The opulent world she thought she owned was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on lies, and I had just removed the final foundational pillar. Mitchell stepped forward, his expression colder than the freezing rain outside, silently observing the absolute destruction of my enemies. The syndicate's ruthless collectors were already moving into position across the city. They were efficient, operating entirely outside the boundaries of civil law. Gavin had foolishly believed his fake corporate stature would shield him from the violent underworld. He was devastatingly wrong. The nightmare was only just beginning, and there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The torrential rain hammered against the empty asphalt of the hotel parking lot, washing away the last remaining fragments of Gavin and Naomi's fabricated high society existence. I sat perfectly dry in the warm, mahogany-paneled sanctuary of my private office, listening to their absolute destruction unfold in real time. Mitchell's elite private investigator had tracked them from the disastrous conference room straight to their cheap, rented sedan, maintaining a secure visual and audio link. The operative kept a high-frequency parabolic microphone trained directly on them from a concealed vantage point. The crystal-clear audio feed streamed straight to my encrypted desktop console, filling my quiet office with the sounds of the freezing storm and their violently collapsing marriage. Naomi's voice pierced the static of the heavy downpour. She was completely unhinged, screaming at Gavin with a vicious, guttural fury that stripped away her entire refined, cashmere-draped persona. She backed him aggressively against the soaked metal door of the rental car, jabbing her manicured finger violently into his chest. She demanded to know how he could possibly be so monumentally stupid, so entirely reckless with their future. She accused him of completely ruining her life, of systematically destroying their flawless social standing, and of selfishly squandering her mother's sacred, untouchable inheritance on his pathetic, fraudulent business ventures. Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch as she recounted the sheer, unbearable humiliation of being evicted and forcefully escorted out of the penthouse by private security. She raised her hand and delivered a brutal, stinging slap directly across Gavin's wet face. The sharp, violent crack echoed loudly over the digital surveillance feed, followed by a momentary, incredibly heavy silence in the freezing rain. Gavin did not cower or apologize. The immense lethal pressure exerted by the offshore gambling syndicate had completely fractured his usual manipulative composure, leaving nothing but raw, venomous survival instinct. He snapped. He lunged forward, instantly closing the distance between them, his voice dripping with unchecked malice. He told his wife to shut her pathetic, entitled mouth. He stated clearly and brutally that she was an absolute fool who had been living inside a manufactured financial fantasy for her entire adult life. He delivered the cruelest truth possible, systematically shattering her final remaining delusion. Gavin explicitly revealed that Evelyn's supposedly sacred inheritance did not exist. There was no secret generational wealth. There was no hidden family fortune magically supporting their luxurious lifestyle. He spat the words directly into her face, explaining that the entire financial trust had been systematically funded by my corporate accounts. I leaned back in my heavy leather office chair, listening to the devastating truth finally hit the open air. During the darkest, most terrifying months of Evelyn's terminal illness, she had been consumed by a profound, agonizing anxiety regarding our daughter's long-term financial security. To grant my dying wife absolute peace of mind, I utilized my holding company to quietly establish a highly lucrative secondary trust fund entirely in her name. I funneled massive, consistent corporate dividends into that specific account, explicitly manufacturing the flawless illusion of separate, independent wealth. Naomi, blinded by her own inherent greed and her desperate need for social superiority, simply assumed her mother possessed vast, private resources. She never once questioned the origin of the capital. She blindly accepted the money, using it to fund her arrogant lifestyle while treating the actual architect of that wealth like an obsolete, worthless burden. Gavin mercilessly weaponized this exact truth against her. He shouted over the rain that every single designer cashmere coat she wore, every luxury European vacation she flaunted on social media, and every expensive piece of diamond jewelry she owned was paid for entirely by the very man she had spent the last month trying to lock inside a state psychiatric ward. The highly sensitive audio feed captured the exact agonizing moment Naomi's manufactured reality collapsed. A sharp, breathless gasp escaped her throat, followed immediately by a heavy, hollow thud as her knees gave out. She slumped downward, collapsing completely against the wet side of the rented sedan. The crushing realization hit her with the unrelenting force of a freight train. She had publicly humiliated, illegally manipulated, and emotionally tortured the only human being on Earth who had ever truly provided for her. She had actively conspired to destroy her own father to please a pathetic, heavily indebted criminal who was currently screaming at her in the mud. Naomi broke down into violent, uncontrollable sobs. Her cries were deep, guttural sounds of absolute, unadulterated despair. I listened to her weeping on the wet asphalt, feeling absolutely nothing. The deep, enduring well of paternal forgiveness I had carried for decades was completely dry. A sharp electronic vibration broke the quiet atmosphere of my office. My smartphone illuminated brightly on the polished desk. The caller identification displayed Naomi's name. She was sitting in the freezing rain, desperately attempting to call me. She was undoubtedly preparing to beg for my forgiveness, to plead for an immediate financial rescue, and to offer a million hollow, meaningless apologies. I stared at the glowing digital screen, watching the incoming call interface pulse rhythmically. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation or lingering guilt. I reached forward and pressed the red icon, instantly terminating the connection. I immediately navigated to her contact profile and engaged the permanent block feature. I severed the final digital cord tying me to my daughter. She had made her irreversible choice the moment she slid that fraudulent non-disclosure agreement across the diner table, and now she would have to survive the devastating consequences of her own blinding arrogance entirely alone. Back on the surveillance feed, Gavin's patience entirely evaporated. The syndicate's lethal midnight deadline was approaching with terrifying velocity, and he was completely out of capital, out of property, and out of viable escape routes. He violently reached down and grabbed Naomi by the arm, roughly hauling her up from the wet asphalt. He shook her aggressively, demanding her immediate compliance. He stated frantically that the cartel collectors were actively hunting them across the city, and they had less than a few hours to disappear completely. He formulated a panicked, highly irrational plan born of pure desperation. He told her they needed a fast, untraceable vehicle and immediate access to liquid valuables. He commanded her to get into the car. They were going to drive directly back to the main estate. Gavin planned to steal my meticulously restored vintage truck from the secondary garage, a vehicle worth well over $100,000 on the underground market. He intended to ransack the main house one final violent time for any hidden cash or portable antiques before fleeing north toward the Canadian border. I listened to the heavy car doors slam shut. The rental car's engine roared to life, the tires screeching against the wet pavement as Gavin aggressively accelerated out of the hotel parking lot, steering the vehicle blindly toward my property. They were driving directly back into the epicenter of the storm, entirely convinced they could execute one last successful robbery to secure their survival. They had absolutely no idea who was waiting for them in the dark. The relentless drumming of the midnight storm against the reinforced glass of my study windows provided a rhythmic backdrop to my anticipation. I sat perfectly still behind my heavy mahogany desk, the room plunged in deep shadows, save for the single amber glow of a reading lamp. I did not bother turning on the main chandeliers. The darkness suited the impending negotiation. Outside, the torrential rain washed over the sprawling estate grounds, turning the manicured lawns into a muddy quagmire. Through the large bay windows, a set of piercing halogen headlights sliced violently through the heavy sheets of water. A sleek, armored black town car navigated the long, winding driveway with predatory purpose, completely ignoring the newly installed security gates that I had deliberately left open. The heavy vehicle rolled to a smooth, calculated stop directly in front of the main portico. The engine idled with a low, menacing rumble. The 4 heavy doors opened simultaneously. 3 men stepped out into the freezing downpour. They did not rush for cover. They moved with the synchronized, deliberate arrogance of apex predators entering a hunting ground. They wore dark, expensive overcoats that repelled the rain, and their postures radiated an unmistakable capacity for extreme violence. This was the leadership of the offshore gambling syndicate. They were the men Gavin had foolishly attempted to defraud the architects of his current desperation, and the violent consequence he believed would ultimately destroy me. I watched them ascend the stone steps, my heart rate entirely steady. I was completely prepared for their arrival. The heavy oak front doors of the estate swung open with a resounding crash, violently yielding to the physical force of the intruders. The security system remained completely silent, deactivated by my own hand moments before. The 3 men marched aggressively down the main hallway, their soaked leather shoes leaving wet, muddy prints across the pristine hardwood floors. They did not bother to search the massive house. They moved with absolute certainty, drawn directly to the single sliver of light spilling from my study. The leader of the syndicate stepped through the doorway first. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, possessing flat, dead eyes that had witnessed and authorized unspeakable acts of cruelty. His 2 lieutenants flanked him instantly, establishing a lethal perimeter within my private sanctuary. They physically loomed over my desk, projecting an aura of overwhelming physical intimidation designed to break the will of ordinary men. The leader did not offer a greeting. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice that cut through the sound of the storm like a serrated blade. He explicitly demanded the immediate delivery of the $2 million my son-in-law Gavin owed his organization. He did not mince words or employ subtle euphemisms. He stated with brutal clarity that Gavin had utilized my name, my estate, and my supposed financial backing as collateral for his massive illegal wagers. The leader leaned forward, placing his dripping leather gloves flat on my polished mahogany desk. He delivered his ultimate ultimatum. If I did not produce the full $2 million in untraceable funds before he walked out of the room, he would order his men to barricade the doors, douse the entire estate in gasoline, and burn the property to the ground with me still sitting inside it. I did not flinch at the threat of immolation. I did not reach for a hidden weapon or attempt to summon my private security forces. I remained entirely calm, rooted in the absolute certainty of my strategic superiority. I slowly reached toward the silver tray resting on the corner of my desk. I picked up a delicate porcelain carafe and methodically poured a steaming cup of dark roast coffee. The gentle, civilized clinking of the porcelain cup against the saucer echoed sharply in the tense, suffocating silence of the study. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark liquid, holding the syndicate leader's dead gaze without breaking eye contact. I placed the cup down and smoothly opened the top drawer of my desk. I withdrew a thick, professionally bound legal folio bearing the embossed seal of the Legacy Holding Company. I slid the heavy document across the polished wood, stopping it exactly 1 inch from the leader's wet gloves. I instructed him to review the certified financial transfers on the second page. The leader frowned, deeply suspicious of my absolute lack of fear. He opened the folder. I watched his flat eyes scan the dense legal terminology. I informed him in a perfectly even tone that the holding company had completely absorbed and formally purchased Gavin's outstanding debts from his mid-level bookmakers less than 4 hours ago. I explicitly detailed the exact offshore routing numbers and the specific cryptocurrency wallets used to finalize the transaction. I did not speak the panicked language of a corporate victim. I spoke the precise, unforgiving language of the syndicate perfectly. Street rules dictate that a formalized, fully funded debt transfer completely erases any prior violent obligations. Gavin's debt was no longer their concern. I legally controlled the $2 million deficit now. Gavin owed his life entirely to me. The syndicate leader stared at the certified transfer receipts, visually verifying the routing numbers against his own internal ledgers. The aggressive, murderous tension slowly drained from his broad shoulders. The realization that I was not a terrified civilian but a ruthless financial operator willing to purchase a man's life debt for leverage fundamentally altered his perception. He closed the blue folder and looked at me with a newfound chilling respect. I reached into my interior jacket pocket and withdrew a pristine certified cashier's check made out to cash in the exact amount of $50,000. I placed the check directly on top of the closed legal folio. I informed the leader that this specific sum was a generous consulting fee. I required a very specific commodity in exchange for the capital. I demanded every single piece of blackmail material, every recorded phone call, every forged signature, and every digital ledger they held regarding Gavin's illegal gambling activities. I wanted the absolute entirety of his criminal footprint. The syndicate leader looked at the check, then looked back at me. A grim, acknowledging smile touched the corners of his mouth. He respected the sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness of the maneuver. He reached into his dark overcoat and produced a small encrypted black flash drive. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a soft click next to my coffee cup. He picked up the cashier's check, pocketed the legal folio, and signaled his men to withdraw. They turned and marched out of the study without uttering another syllable. I listened to the heavy front doors slam shut. The black town car's engine roared, the vehicle disappearing into the freezing rain. Less than 1 minute later, a battered, rented sedan sped recklessly up the muddy driveway. Gavin and Naomi had arrived. The trap was perfectly set. I picked up my phone, called Mitchell, and told him to bring the police. The end was here. I smiled into the darkness. It was time. The battered rental sedan tore up the main driveway, its tires slipping dangerously on the wet gravel before slamming to a violent halt near the secondary garage. The engine sputtered and died as the 2 front doors swung open almost simultaneously. Gavin and Naomi spilled out into the freezing deluge, instantly soaked by the relentless storm. They moved with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of cornered animals. Gavin did not bother to secure the vehicle. He reached into the back seat and retrieved a heavy steel crowbar, his knuckles white against the dark metal. He sprinted directly toward the secondary garage, his eyes locked onto the gleaming chrome of my meticulously restored vintage truck. The vehicle was worth well over $100,000 in cash to the right underground broker, making it the perfect getaway vehicle and funding source for a man desperate to reach the Canadian border. He raised the iron bar high above his shoulder, fully intending to shatter the thick glass window, rip out the steering column casing, and hotwire the ignition before the syndicate could locate him. Naomi did not follow her husband to the garage. She left him in the mud and sprinted directly toward the main house. Her expensive designer shoes slipped on the slick stone pathway, ruining the delicate leather as she scrambled up the steps. She pounded her wet fists violently against the heavy oak front doors. She screamed my name at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. She demanded that I open the door immediately. She shrieked that I needed to hand over the keys to the truck, unlock the main floor safe, and surrender whatever cash I kept on the premises. She justified her demands by screaming that her life was in mortal danger, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that she had spent the last several weeks actively plotting to destroy mine. She possessed no shame, no remorse, and no remaining shred of dignity. She was merely a parasite demanding to be saved from the consequences of her own blinding arrogance. I did not rush to the door or activate the automated perimeter alarms. I simply reached out, grasped the brass handle, and pulled the heavy oak door open. I stepped out onto the sheltered expanse of the wide covered porch. I did not move from the top step. I stood perfectly insulated from the freezing rain, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. I held my delicate porcelain coffee cup in my right hand. I looked down at my frantic daughter and took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark roast coffee. The warm, rich aroma contrasted sharply with the bitter stench of wet asphalt and raw desperation emanating from the driveway. Naomi froze her fists, suspended in the air. She stared at me, completely paralyzed by my utter lack of fear or urgency. She opened her mouth to scream another demand, but the words died in her throat. At that exact moment, the piercing, unmistakable sound of wailing sirens shattered the quiet isolation of the storm. The noise began as a distant humming pitch before rapidly escalating into a deafening roaring tone. Bright, aggressive flashes of red and blue light sliced violently through the heavy darkness, illuminating the rain in chaotic bursts of color. 4 heavy police cruisers barreled down the dark country road, their engines roaring as they executed a synchronized fast maneuver. They skidded onto the property, completely barricading the bottom of the long, winding driveway. Their vehicles formed an impenetrable steel wall, physically severing the only viable escape route for Gavin and Naomi. The blinding strobe lights swept across the manicured lawns, casting long, erratic shadows against the stone facade of the main estate. I took another measured sip of my coffee, watching the tactical deployment unfold precisely as planned. I had explicitly coordinated the exact timing of this police arrival with Mitchell hours ago. By tracking the location transponder secretly installed in their rental vehicle, Mitchell and I monitored their precise movements from the downtown hotel back to the estate. We accurately calculated their drive time, factoring in the severe weather conditions and the erratic emotional state of Gavin. I deliberately left the front security gates wide open to invite them onto the grounds. I wanted Gavin caught securely in the act by law enforcement, physically standing on my private property while aggressively holding a deadly weapon. The timing was absolutely flawless. The doors of the 4 police cruisers swung open simultaneously. Heavily armed, uniformed officers stepped out into the freezing rain, immediately establishing a tactical perimeter around the barricaded driveway. They unholstered their weapons, aiming the bright beams of their tactical flashlights directly at the soaked figure standing near the vintage truck. From the lead cruiser, Mitchell stepped out onto the wet asphalt. He wore a dark tailored trench coat, entirely unfazed by the torrential downpour. He moved with the calm, predatory grace of a man who had successfully cornered his prey. Walking directly beside Mitchell was a stern, impeccably dressed federal fraud investigator. The investigator carried a thick, waterproof briefcase, representing the absolute crushing weight of the federal justice system. They marched steadily up the driveway, flanked by the armed officers, bringing the inescapable reality of total catastrophic failure directly to his feet. The police did not arrive with mere suspicions or circumstantial allegations. They held the complete, undeniable dossier of his extensive criminal enterprise. Mitchell had meticulously compiled and surrendered every single piece of devastating evidence. The investigator carried the pristine banking records detailing the massive corporate embezzlement. The briefcase held the legally verified documentation of the forged bridge loan he had attempted to secure against my properties. It contained the explicit bank transfers proving the illegal payments to the fake medical evaluators hired to declare me incompetent. It held the high-definition video footage capturing the violent armed break-in through my living room window earlier that night. Furthermore, the dossier now included the encrypted flash drive I had recently acquired directly from the gambling syndicate containing the absolute totality of his illegal offshore wagers and documented extortion attempts. The trap was not merely sprung, it was hermetically sealed. Gavin stood paralyzed beside the vintage truck, temporarily blinded by the intense beams of the police flashlights. The heavy red and blue strobes reflected off his wet, terrified face. He looked at the armed officers, then at the federal investigator, and finally up at me standing calmly on the porch. He fully comprehended the sheer devastating magnitude of the operation orchestrated against him. He realized that every desperate move he had made over the last months had been carefully anticipated, monitored, and expertly countered. He had never been in control. He had been playing a rigged game against an opponent who operated outside his limited capacity. His arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a broken man. The steel crowbar slipped from his trembling, soaked fingers. It plummeted toward the ground, striking the wet asphalt with a loud, ringing clatter. He raised his empty hands upward. Naomi stood frozen at the stairs, staring at the lights in sheer horror. There was absolutely nowhere left for them to safely run. The tactical perimeter instantly tightened around the stolen vintage truck, sealing off the muddy driveway with absolute precision. 4 heavily armed officers advanced steadily through the freezing downpour, their service weapons drawn and locked directly onto Gavin's chest. The commanding officer shouted over the roaring wind, explicitly ordering the cornered man to drop the heavy steel crowbar, fall to his knees, and place his hands flat on the wet asphalt. Gavin did not possess a single ounce of defiance or residual corporate arrogance. His fabricated armor had completely dissolved into the freezing rain, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell. The crowbar slipped from his trembling, soaked fingers, plummeting toward the ground and striking the asphalt with a loud clatter that echoed above the sirens. He collapsed heavily into the thick mud, the filthy water soaking through his expensive, tailored suit. He raised his empty, shaking hands high into the air, his chest heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. He wept with the pathetic, unrestrained desperation of a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. The federal fraud investigator stepped smoothly past the illuminated perimeter line, holding his waterproof briefcase with absolute, uncompromising authority. He looked down at the weeping man with profound professional disgust. The investigator did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the chaos of the storm with surgical precision as he systematically read Gavin his Miranda rights. He detailed the devastating list of incoming federal charges, ensuring Gavin understood he would never see the outside of a penitentiary again. The undeniable reality of a multi-million-dollar federal indictment completely shattered Gavin's remaining sanity. The exact moment the investigator explicitly mentioned the massive corporate embezzlement, the forged real estate bridge loan, and the fabricated medical evaluations, Gavin violently twisted his upper body toward the main house. He pointed a shaking, mud-caked finger directly at Naomi, who remained paralyzed near the bottom of the wooden porch stairs. He began screaming with a hysterical, venomous fury, desperately attempting to shift the crushing weight of the federal charges entirely onto his wife. He shrieked into the freezing wind that the entire financial conspiracy was her brilliant idea from the very beginning. He wildly claimed that Naomi was the true calculating mastermind behind the forgery, insisting that she had relentlessly forced him to commit massive corporate fraud simply to maintain her obscene luxury lifestyle. He shouted that her insatiable greed for designer clothes, exclusive downtown penthouses, and elite social standing had driven him to the absolute brink of financial insanity. He begged the stern federal investigator to look at her pathetic tears streaming down his face, actively painting himself as a tragic, manipulated victim who had only broken the law to satisfy a relentlessly demanding spouse. He threw the woman he had sworn to protect directly to the wolves, demonstrating zero loyalty, zero honor, and zero remorse in his frantic bid for self-preservation. Naomi unleashed a shrill, guttural shriek of absolute, unadulterated betrayal. The horrifying sound tore through the freezing rain, echoing loudly across the chaotic, brightly lit driveway. She stared at her husband with wide, horrified eyes, her mind completely unable to process the sheer, calculated viciousness of his lies. The man she had blindly followed, the man for whom she had actively conspired to destroy her own father, was currently screaming for her to be locked inside a federal prison to save himself. She finally recognized the true, terrifying nature of the cowardly parasite she had married. He did not love her, and he never truly had. He had merely utilized her as a convenient shield and a lucrative financial gateway, and now he was willingly sacrificing her life to save his own miserable skin. The federal investigator ignored Gavin's pathetic pleading and nodded sharply to the advancing officers. The police moved in with aggressive, uncompromising force to secure the perimeter. 2 officers violently grabbed Gavin's arms, wrenching them forcefully behind his back and locking cold steel handcuffs around his wrists with a sharp, definitive click. Simultaneously, 2 other officers rapidly flanked Naomi. She screamed and thrashed wildly as they grabbed her expensive designer coat, completely ruining the delicate fabric in the mud. They forced her hands firmly behind her back, the metallic snap of the heavy handcuffs permanently sealing her fate and ending her opulent reign. The officers roughly hauled both Gavin and Naomi to their feet, preparing to separate them into the back of the waiting police cruisers. They dragged Naomi directly past the heavy wooden steps of the main porch. The freezing rain plastered her expensive salon hair flat to her face, mingling with tears and rapidly melting cosmetics. Her perfect, meticulously crafted high society facade had been completely washed away, leaving a terrified, broken woman shivering violently in the bitter cold. As the officers pulled her forward, she dug the heels of her ruined shoes deep into the wet gravel, forcing them to halt for a fraction of a second. She turned her head and looked directly up at me. I remained standing perfectly still on the top step, entirely shielded from the violent storm, watching the tactical extraction with cold, detached precision. Naomi's chest heaved erratically. Dark, ugly streaks of ruined mascara ran heavily down her pale cheeks, completely destroying the arrogant beauty she had weaponized against me for years. She stared deeply into my eyes, searching desperately for the unconditional paternal safety net she had spent her entire adult life taking for granted. She opened her mouth, her voice cracking under the overwhelming, crushing weight of the federal arrest. She begged me to call off the police immediately. She pleaded with me to pay the investigator to fix the catastrophic legal disaster and to make the nightmare stop. Then her voice dropped to a desperate, weeping whisper. She called me Daddy. That single word hung in the freezing air, attempting to bridge an uncrossable chasm. It was the first time she had utilized that term in 10 years. The trigger transported my mind back a decade. The last time that word crossed her lips was on her 16th birthday. I restored a convertible for her. When I handed her the keys, she threw her arms around my neck, radiating joy, and called me Daddy. That memory remained my treasured possession through years of mounting cruelty. Hearing her weaponize that memory, now twisting love into a tool for legal salvation, acted as a final catalyst. It burned away any fraction of paternal weakness. It solidified my heart into iron. She was not a scared child. She was a criminal attempting to exploit a father's love to escape prison. She pleaded for the protection I always provided. I stood straight, aligning myself with uncompromising authority. I lowered my coffee cup. I walked to the edge of the porch steps. I looked down at my daughter from a position of absolute power. The strobes of the police lights cut through the storm, reflecting in my unblinking eyes. I did not see the child I had raised. I saw an enemy combatant who willingly chose the losing side of an unforgiving war. The heavy rain continued to batter the ruined estate as I prepared to deliver my final judgment. The flashing strobes of the police cruisers continued to slice violently through the torrential downpour, illuminating the mud-slicked driveway and the terrified, soaked figures of Gavin and Naomi. 2 heavily armed tactical officers flanked my daughter, maintaining a firm grip on her arms. They paused their extraction, reading the absolute finality in my posture. They afforded me a brief, unspoken moment to address the woman I had raised. The heavy rain washed the dark mud in slow, filthy streams down the sloped asphalt, carrying away the last physical remnants of Gavin's pathetic escape attempt. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the covered wooden porch. I looked down at Naomi. Her expensive designer coat was ruined, plastered to her shivering body by the freezing storm. Her makeup ran in dark, chaotic streaks across her face. She stared up at me with wide, panicked eyes, completely expecting a sudden, miraculous reprieve. She genuinely believed that my paternal instinct would override the overwhelming, documented evidence of her massive federal crimes. She was waiting for me to step down into the rain, order the police off my property, and shield her from the devastating consequences of her own actions. I did not step down. I did not soften my expression or offer a single gesture of comfort. I spoke in a voice entirely devoid of anger, entirely devoid of pity, and entirely devoid of the unconditional love she had spent her adult life exploiting. I projected my voice clearly over the roaring wind, ensuring every word landed with surgical precision. I informed Naomi that a true daughter does not actively orchestrate the financial and psychological destruction of her own father to secure a luxury paycheck. I stated that a true daughter does not willingly collaborate with a desperate indebted criminal to forge deeds, manufacture false medical evaluations, and coordinate violent home invasions simply to maintain a penthouse lifestyle. I did not allow her to interrupt or formulate a pathetic excuse. I reached into my memory and extracted a very specific, deeply painful piece of evidence. I recited word for perfect word the exact text message she had sent to a friend on the precise afternoon we buried Evelyn. I repeated her cold, calculating words, stating explicitly that she was already calculating how quickly she could liquidate the primary estate once I was out of the picture. I watched the realization of my complete awareness strike her like a physical blow. The absolute shock temporarily paralyzed her vocal cords. I continued my devastating assessment. I explained calmly that for my entire adult life, I had operated as an impenetrable shield. I had utilized my wealth, my resources, and my relentless work ethic to completely insulate my family from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of the real world. I had built a fortress of comfort and security, and in doing so, I had inadvertently manufactured two entitled, profoundly arrogant adults who believed they were entirely immune to consequence. I told her that my protective responsibilities as a father ended the exact, undeniable moment she consciously chose absolute greed over our family bond. I stated clearly that she had looked at a lifetime of unwavering support and decided it was an obstacle to be violently removed. I looked directly into her ruined, tear-filled eyes. I delivered my final, unalterable judgment. I told Naomi that she had made her choice. She had chosen to align herself with Gavin. She had chosen his lies, his fraud, and his pathetic criminal ambitions over my loyalty. I informed her that because she had willingly chosen her husband, she must now fully share his catastrophic fate. Naomi let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The absolute finality of my words crushed the remaining hope from her lungs. She realized simultaneously that there would be no last-minute rescue, no high-priced defense attorney provided by my corporate accounts, and no safe harbor waiting for her when the federal indictment landed. She began to thrash wildly against the officer's grip, screaming my name with a hysterical, guttural desperation. She demanded that I stop the police. She shrieked that she was sorry that she didn't know the extent of Gavin's crimes, that she was merely a victim of his manipulation. I did not react to her violent outburst. I did not blink or turn my head. I simply raised my right hand and delivered a single sharp nod to the commanding tactical officer. The brief pause was immediately terminated. The two officers surged forward with aggressive, uncompromising force. They physically overpowered Naomi's frantic resistance, forcefully steering her toward the barricade of waiting police cruisers. They opened the heavy rear door of the lead vehicle and aggressively pushed her inside. I watched her collapse onto the hard plastic seat, the heavy door slamming shut with a definitive metallic crash that severed her completely from the outside world. 50 feet away, near the stolen vintage truck, Gavin was receiving identical treatment. The federal investigator watched with cold satisfaction as two armed officers forcefully hauled Gavin upright from the mud. They shoved him roughly toward a separate cruiser, maintaining a tight, inescapable grip on his handcuffed wrists. Gavin did not fight. He moved with the numb, defeated shuffle of a man walking directly to the gallows. He was thrown into the back of the secondary vehicle, disappearing entirely into the dark, caged interior. The commanding officer signaled the extraction was complete. The federal investigator offered me a brief professional nod of acknowledgement before stepping into his own unmarked vehicle. The 4 police cruisers executed a tight, synchronized turn at the bottom of the muddy driveway. Their engines roared tires gripping the wet asphalt as they accelerated away from the property. The blinding red and blue strobe lights faded rapidly into the distance, swallowed entirely by the freezing rain and the dense darkness of the country road. Within 60 seconds, the entire chaotic, violent intrusion had vanished, leaving my estate in a state of profound, absolute silence. The only remaining sound was the relentless drumming of the storm against the slate roof and the heavy wooden porch. I stood completely alone in the freezing night air. I looked down at the empty, mud-slicked driveway. The immediate catastrophic threat to my life, my property, and my legacy was permanently neutralized. Gavin and Naomi were gone, locked securely within the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The gambling syndicate was satisfied, legally bound by the terms of the corporate debt transfer and the generous consulting fee. The violent storm that had battered my life for months had finally broken, leaving behind a clean, hard clarity. I did not feel a sense of triumphant victory or overwhelming joy. I felt a deep, enduring exhaustion coupled with a cold, absolute peace. I had successfully excised a malignant infection from my life, utilizing the precise, ruthless tactics required for total survival. I took one final breath of the cold, rain-washed air. I turned around, my heavy leather shoes echoing softly against the wooden floorboards. I walked slowly back through the heavy oak doors, securing the locks firmly behind me. I moved down the quiet hallway, heading directly toward the amber glow of my private study. The physical confrontation was finished, but the operation required one final precise maneuver. I needed to execute the ultimate legal protocol. I approached my mahogany desk, preparing to finalize the last devastating piece of paperwork. 6 months evaporated into an undisturbed life. The violent freezing storm that had battered my estate and washed away the final remnants of my fractured family was now a distant memory. I sat comfortably in the plush leather chair across from Mitchell in his pristine downtown corner office. The heavy oak door was closed, sealing us inside. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm rectangles of light across his polished glass desk. The frantic, desperate energy that had consumed Gavin and Naomi during their final days of freedom had been entirely replaced by the cold, slow, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The turbulence that had infected my life for years was officially over. The legal fallout was comprehensive and utterly devastating for the architects of the attempted fraud. Gavin lacked the stamina to survive a federal trial. Faced with undeniable evidence including encrypted syndicate ledgers, forged deeds, and high-definition surveillance footage, his defense attorney advised him to surrender. He pled guilty to wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempted extortion. The federal judge handed down a crushing sentence. Gavin received 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He would spend 2 decades stripped of his designer suits, luxury watches, and fabricated arrogance, isolated from the opulent world he tried to steal. Naomi did not escape the blast radius of her husband's actions. Despite frantic attempts to portray herself as a naive victim, the digital trail of evidence proved otherwise. Prosecutors uncovered text messages and financial transfers demonstrating her willing participation in the conspiracy to declare me mentally incompetent and liquidate my assets. She was formally charged as a direct accessory to wire fraud. The judge delivered a scathing reprimand regarding her lack of moral character and filial loyalty. She received 5 years in a federal facility. There would be no early parole, no luxury accommodations, and no financial rescue. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. I did not submit a letter requesting leniency. I allowed the full, unmitigated weight of consequence to crash down upon her shoulders. The protective shield I had maintained for her entire life was permanently dismantled. She chose her husband, she chose his greed, and now she was forced to share his grim, institutionalized fate. Mitchell slid freshly printed legal documents across his desk. These were not the forged papers of a desperate criminal. These were the ironclad instruments of a true legacy. I picked up my fountain pen and began to sign my name. With every stroke of the pen, I was officially establishing the Evelyn Memorial Scholarship Fund. I was permanently redirecting the vast accumulated assets of my corporate holding company away from the toxic abyss of familial greed. Instead, the money would flow into an independently managed trust dedicated to funding the higher education of underprivileged students from my hometown. I was taking the wealth Naomi assumed was her inherent right and transforming it into a powerful engine of opportunity for young people who understood the value of hard work, struggle, and sacrifice. Evelyn had always believed in the transformative power of education. She had spent her life demonstrating quiet kindness. Funding this scholarship was the only authentic way to honor her sacred memory. It cleansed the taint of Gavin and Naomi's corruption from our family name. I signed the final page, capping the pen with a satisfying click. I pushed the completed folio across the desk. Mitchell gathered the documents, reflecting professional satisfaction. He placed them securely into his briefcase. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and extended his hand toward me. I stood and met his grip. The handshake was firm, silent, and loaded with mutual respect. Mitchell had witnessed the absolute depths of my family's betrayal, standing by me as I executed the necessary amputation of that cancer. He looked me directly in the eyes, expressing quiet acknowledgement of the brutal victory we had achieved. I left Mitchell's office and drove the familiar route back to my estate. The sky above the city was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was warm, clear, and perfectly still. The suffocating tension that used to grip my chest whenever I approached the property line had vanished. I steered my vehicle through the security gates, watching them glide shut behind me in the rearview mirror, locking out the noise and chaos of the world. The long driveway was dry and pristine, bearing absolutely no trace of the violent extraction that occurred 6 months prior. The main house stood tall and majestic against the backdrop of the green forest. It no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt entirely like a sanctuary. I parked my car and walked up the stone steps to the wide covered porch. I paused for a moment at the exact spot where I had stood and watched the police drag my daughter away into the freezing rain. The memory did not bring a surge of lingering sorrow or paternal regret. It simply felt like a closed chapter in a very old book. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors and stepped inside the grand foyer. The house was impeccably clean, filled with the warm, golden light of the mid-afternoon sun. The profound silence of the empty hallways was not a symbol of loneliness. It was the beautiful, resonant sound of absolute peace. There were no incoming demands for money, no fabricated emergencies, and no poisonous whispers echoing from the living room. I had lost the illusion of a loving family, but the reality I gained in its place was infinitely more valuable. I took off my suit jacket and hung it neatly on the coat rack. I rolled up the crisp sleeves of my dress shirt and walked deliberately toward the rear of the house. I opened the sturdy wooden door leading down to my basement workshop. The familiar, comforting scent of aged wood tung oil and sharp sawdust greeted me instantly. The workshop was my true domain, a place where raw, unpolished materials were transformed into items of lasting value through patience and meticulous effort. I walked over to the sturdy wooden workbench and reached out to turn the dial on my old vintage radio. A smooth jazz melody crackled to life, the rich notes of a saxophone filling the underground room with a warm, steady rhythm. I walked to the lumber rack and selected a heavy piece of rough oak. It was stubborn wood, requiring a firm hand and a sharp blade to shape. I carried it back to the workbench and locked it securely into the iron vise. I reached into my leather tool roll and picked up my favorite carbon steel carving chisel. The handle was worn perfectly smooth from decades of use, fitting into my palm like a natural extension of my own body. I pressed the sharp edge of the metal against the rough grain of the oak. I pushed forward, peeling away a long, curling ribbon of wood. The simple physical action grounded me entirely in the present moment. I had reclaimed my absolute dignity, my financial freedom, and my enduring peace of mind. The house above me was quiet, secure, and mine. The silent adjustment was finally, unequivocally complete. Did this story resonate with you? Share your thoughts and personal reflections in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives.